Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey that will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about inequality. What I'm about to tell you happened just 150 years ago, but it's so extreme it sounds like science fiction. In Victorian England, the gap between rich and poor wasn't just about money. It was literally about life and death. Are you ready for this? The wealthy lived an average of 60 years, while the poor died at just 15. That's not a typo. 15 years old. But here's the part that will haunt you. And trust me, you'll never look at wealth the same way again. Some of the richest people spent more money on a single dinner party than entire families would see in their entire lifetime. And what they did with that money, it's beyond shocking. Before we dive into this incredible tale together, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button, but only if you're genuinely ready to have your mind blown tonight. I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Are you tucked in somewhere cozy or maybe winding down after a long day? Drop a comment and let me know your location. I love seeing our global family come together. Now, get comfortable. Maybe grab a warm drink and prepare yourself for a story so extreme, you'll question everything about how society works. Picture London, 1837. Queen Victoria has just taken the throne, and the British Empire rules a quarter of the world. But here's what the history books don't tell you. London wasn't one city. It was two completely separate universes occupying the same space. Let me take you inside both worlds, starting with a morning that will blow your mind. It's 6 a.m. In a Belgravia mansion, the Duke of Westminster's 7-year-old son is being dressed by 3 different servants. His outfit for breakfast, just breakfast, costs more than most people earn in a year. The buttons on his jacket, pure gold. The thread in his socks, silk imported from China. Now, at the exact same moment, just 3 miles away in Whitechapel, 7-year-old Tommy is already 2 hours into his workday. He's crawling through a coal mine tunnel so narrow that adults can't fit. His job to check for deadly gas leaks. If he finds gas, he lights a candle and runs. If the mine explodes, well, no one really kept track of children like Tommy. But here's where this gets absolutely insane. That same morning, while the Duke's son is choosing between 12 different breakfast options, Tommy's sharing a single piece of mouldy bread with his 4 siblings. The cost of the Duke's son's breakfast? Enough to feed Tommy's entire neighborhood for a week. And this is just the beginning. The numbers I'm about to share with you are so extreme you might think I'm making them up. A single chandelier in the Duke's dining room cost $3,000. That's $500,000 today. To put that in perspective, a skilled worker would need to save every penny for 30 years without eating, sleeping indoors, or buying clothes to afford just the lighting in one room. But here's the detail that will give you chills. While wealthy children worried about which pony to ride for their afternoon lesson, poor children were sold, yes, sold, to factory owners. Parents received a few shillings, and their children disappeared into textile mills where they worked 18-hour days until their bodies gave out. The average lifespan of a child worker, 3 years from the day they started. Now, you might be thinking this is horrible, but surely people knew and tried to help. Here's the shocking truth. The wealthy had no idea this was happening. They lived in such complete isolation that poverty was literally invisible to them. When Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist, wealthy readers complained that he was exaggerating for dramatic effect. They genuinely believed children begging for more food was unrealistic fiction. The geography tells this story perfectly. Rich neighborhoods were built upwind from poor areas. This wasn't accident, it was intentional. The wealthy literally positioned themselves so the wind would blow the smoke, smells, and disease away from them and toward the poor. They created a system where they couldn't even smell the consequences of their privilege. Let me tell you about Lady Catherine Pemberton, whose diary was discovered in 1987. She wrote detailed accounts of her daily life, including this entry from March 1843. Spent $200 today on new gloves, as last week's are no longer fashionable. That same day, parliamentary records show that 847 children died of starvation in London workhouses. The cost of her gloves could have fed every single one of those children for months. But here's what's truly mind-bending. The wealthy genuinely believed this inequality was God's will. They attended church services where priests told them that their wealth was proof of moral superiority, while poverty was evidence of sin. They felt virtuous about their privilege, believing they deserved every luxury while the poor deserved their suffering. The contrast in daily life is almost surreal. Wealthy Victorian women employed food tasters to ensure their meals weren't poisoned, while poor women fed their children clay mixed with water to stop their hunger pains. Rich families had rooms designated for specific times of day: morning rooms, afternoon rooms, evening rooms, while poor families prayed their single room wouldn't flood when it rained. And here's a detail that shows just how different these worlds were. Wealthy homes had a servant whose only job was to carry messages between family members in different parts of the house, because the mansions were so large that shouting wouldn't work. Meanwhile, entire poor families lived in spaces smaller than those wealthy families' closets. But perhaps the most shocking part isn't the material differences, it's the psychological distance. When wealthy Victorians encountered poverty at all, it was through carefully orchestrated charity events where they could feel virtuous while maintaining their distance. They would literally dress up in their finest clothes to hand out day-old bread to starving families, then return to homes where they threw away more food than those families would see in months. The wealthy worried about which fork to use for the fish course, while the poor worried about whether their children would survive the winter. The rich planned elaborate parties that lasted for days and cost more than entire neighborhoods earned in a year, while working families planned which child might need to be sent away when money ran out. As we've seen tonight, Victorian England created an inequality so extreme it defies belief. The numbers, the stories, the sheer human cost, it's almost impossible to comprehend. But what we've uncovered tonight is just the tip of the iceberg, because next we're going to step inside the actual buildings where these two worlds existed. When you see the architectural madness of Victorian mansions compared to the hellish reality of slum housing, you'll understand why historians call it the architecture of inequality. The contrast will leave you speechless, and the secrets hidden within those walls will reveal truths about human nature that will keep you awake long after this story ends. Now imagine walking through the front door of Chatsworth House in 1845. You step into an entrance hall so vast that entire families could live inside it comfortably. The ceiling soars 60 feet above your head, decorated with gold leaf that cost more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. But here's what will absolutely stagger you. This is just the entrance. The house has 175 rooms, and some of them are larger than entire city blocks in the slums. Let me paint you a picture that sounds like fantasy but is documented historical fact. The Duke of Devonshire's bathroom, just one of his 12 bathrooms, featured a bathtub carved from a single piece of marble that took 40 men 3 months to install. The cost: $8,000. That's over $1 million today. Meanwhile, in the back-to-back houses of Manchester, 200 families shared a single outdoor toilet that was emptied once a month if they were lucky. But here's where architecture becomes truly shocking. The wealthy didn't just build big houses, they built monuments to excess that defied all logic. Take Blenheim Palace, where the Duke of Marlborough lived. It covers 7 acres under one roof. 7 acres! To put that in perspective, you could fit 2,000 average working-class homes inside that single building. And here's the kicker. It was home to just 4 people and their 300 servants. Now let's step into the other world. Picture this if you can. Dorset Street in London's East End, known as the worst street in London. The buildings here weren't really buildings at all. They were death traps masquerading as homes. Families of 8, 10, sometimes 12 people, crammed into single rooms measuring just 12 feet by 12 feet. But wait, it gets worse. These weren't even ground floor rooms. Most were basement cellars that flooded every time it rained, which in London, as you know, is quite often. Here's a detail that will make your skin crawl. In these slum buildings, the walls were so thin you could hear every conversation, every cough, every cry of hunger from your neighbours. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Compare that to wealthy homes where some bedrooms were so far apart that families used bell systems to communicate, because walking from one end to the other would take 10 minutes. Let me tell you about something called rookeries. And no, these weren't charming birdhouses. These were vertical slums where buildings had been subdivided so many times that families lived in spaces that were originally built as closets. The government's own housing report from 1842 documented rooms where the ceiling was so low that adults couldn't stand upright, and families had to crawl to move around their own homes. But here's what's truly mind-boggling about wealthy Victorian homes. They had rooms for everything. Are you ready for this list? They had separate rooms for arranging flowers, storing china, ironing newspapers. Yes, that was a thing. Cleaning boots, storing hunting equipment, and my personal favourite, a room specifically for sulking when you were upset. Meanwhile, poor families were grateful if their single room had a window, even if it faced a brick wall 3 inches away. The bathroom situation alone tells this story perfectly. Wealthy homes had multiple water closets with imported porcelain fixtures, heated towel rails, and even early versions of toilet paper made from silk. Some had bathrooms larger than entire poor families' living spaces. In contrast, working-class neighbourhoods had communal night soil men, who came around once a week to empty shared toilets that served hundreds of people. Now here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. Rich Victorian houses were so large that servants got lost in them. Chatsworth House employed a person whose only job was to give directions to new staff members. They literally needed a human GPS system for their own home. Meanwhile, in the slums, you could touch all 4 walls of a room without moving your feet. Let me share a story that perfectly captures this insanity. In 1847, the Earl of Lonsdale decided his dining room wasn't impressive enough, so he had it completely rebuilt. The new room was designed to seat 100 people comfortably, with a table so long that servants on horseback delivered food from one end to the other. The renovation cost $50,000, enough money to build decent housing for 5,000 working families. And here's the truly absurd part. He used the room maybe 10 times a year. But the architectural inequality wasn't just about size. It was about basic human needs. Wealthy homes had central heating systems that could warm dozens of rooms simultaneously. They had gas lighting that turned night into day at the flip of a switch. They had running water, indoor plumbing, and even early air circulation systems. Poor homes. They had whatever heat you could generate from burning scraps of wood or coal if you could afford it. Light came from candles if you were lucky, or you simply lived in darkness. Water meant walking to a communal pump that might work, might not, and definitely wasn't clean. Here's a detail that shows just how different these worlds were. Wealthy Victorian homes had morning rooms that faced east to catch the sunrise, afternoon rooms that faced south for optimal lighting, and evening rooms that faced west for sunset views. They literally designed their homes around the sun's movement. Poor families were thrilled if their one room had any natural light at all, regardless of direction. And can we talk about the absurdity of wealthy Victorian storage for a moment? These people had rooms specifically for storing out-of-season clothing. They had wine cellars that could hold thousands of bottles. They had libraries with books they'd never read, game rooms with equipment they'd never use, and conservatories with plants they'd never touch. Meanwhile, working families owned so few possessions that everything they had could fit in a single wooden crate. The construction materials tell their own story of inequality. Wealthy homes used imported marble from Italy, rare woods from tropical forests, and stones quarried specifically for each project. Poor housing was built from whatever was cheapest and most readily available, often reused materials from demolished buildings, creating structures that were basically held together by hope and desperation. But here's perhaps the most shocking architectural detail of all. Wealthy Victorian homes were built to last centuries, while poor housing was essentially disposable. Rich families planned their homes as legacies for future generations, while poor families knew their buildings might collapse at any moment. Government surveys from the 1840s documented slum buildings, where the upper floors had simply fallen through to the lower ones, and families continued living in the wreckage because they had nowhere else to go. The heating systems alone reveal the absurdity of this inequality. Wealthy homes had fireplaces in every room, not because they needed them, but because they could. Some mansions had over 50 fireplaces, requiring small armies of servants just to maintain them. Poor families might have access to a single fireplace shared between multiple families, or more often, they simply wore every piece of clothing they owned to bed and hoped for the best. Have you ever wondered how these wealthy families even found each other in their own homes? Some Victorian mansions were so massive that they employed horn players, yes, actual musicians, whose job was to play specific musical signals to call family members for meals. Imagine being so rich that you need a personal orchestra just to gather for dinner. As we've seen, Victorian architecture wasn't just about buildings. It was about creating physical manifestations of inequality so extreme that they seem impossible to believe. The contrast between marble palaces and death-trap slums reveals a society that had completely lost touch with basic human dignity. But if you think the architectural inequality was shocking, wait until you discover what these two worlds actually ate. The difference between a wealthy Victorian feast and a poor family's daily struggle for nutrition will reveal truths about human nature that are both heartbreaking and absolutely stunning. What happened at Victorian dinner tables will change everything you think you know about food, survival, and the lengths people will go to when they're truly desperate. The dinner bell rings at Apsley House, and what happens next will completely redefine your understanding of excess. The Duke of Wellington, yes, the man who defeated Napoleon, sits down to his evening meal. But this isn't just dinner. It's a theatrical production of wealth that would make modern billionaires blush. The table stretches 40 feet long, set with solid gold plates that each weigh more than a working man's weekly wages. Tonight's menu? 12 courses, featuring delicacies from 4 different continents, prepared by a team of French chefs who earn more in a month than most families see in a year. But here's what will absolutely stagger you. While the Duke debates whether to have his turtle soup served in the shell or in crystal bowls, just 2 miles away in Bethnal Green, 8-year-old Mary Sullivan is chewing on leather. Not metaphorically, literally chewing on pieces of boot leather to stop her stomach from cramping with hunger. This actually happened, documented in Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor from 1851. Let me take you inside a wealthy Victorian feast, because the numbers are so insane they sound made up. A single dinner party hosted by Lord Rothschild in 1845 featured £200 of caviar, 50 bottles of champagne that cost $10 each, and a centrepiece made entirely of orchids flown in from South America. The total cost? $5,000, enough to feed every hungry person in London for 3 months. And this was just a Tuesday night dinner for 20 guests. Now contrast that with what the poor actually ate, and I promise you'll never take your next meal for granted again. Parliamentary investigations from the 1840s documented families surviving on pauper soup, water boiled with whatever scraps they could find. Sometimes that meant potato peels, sometimes bones with no meat left on them, and sometimes things I probably shouldn't mention while you're trying to relax. But here's where this gets truly heartbreaking. Poor families didn't just eat differently. They ate on completely different schedules because food was so scarce. While wealthy Victorians enjoyed 5 meals a day, breakfast, second breakfast, lunch, afternoon tea and dinner, working families often ate just once every other day. Children would go to bed sucking on clay or chalk to trick their stomachs into feeling full. Here's a detail that will blow your mind about wealthy Victorian dining. They had servants whose only job was to ensure the food was the perfect temperature when it reached the table. Some wealthy homes employed food runners who would sprint from the kitchen to the dining room to prevent soup from cooling by even a degree. Meanwhile, poor families considered themselves incredibly fortunate if their food was cooked at all, since many couldn't afford fuel for fires. Let me tell you about something called mock turtle soup that perfectly illustrates this insanity. Real turtle soup was made from actual sea turtles imported at enormous expense from the Caribbean. It was so costly that only the super wealthy could afford it. So the middle class created mock turtle soup using calf's head to imitate the taste. But here's the kicker. Even the fake version cost more than working families spent on food in an entire month. And speaking of expensive foods, let's talk about pineapples for a moment. In Victorian England, a single pineapple cost $60. That's about $8,000 today. They were so valuable that wealthy families didn't even eat them. They displayed them at parties as status symbols, then returned them to specialty shops for rental. Yes, you could rent a pineapple for your dinner party. Meanwhile, working families had never even seen tropical fruit, let alone tasted it. But the most shocking part isn't just what the wealthy ate, it's what they threw away. Kitchen records from Chatsworth House show that in 1843, they discarded enough leftover food each week to feed 200 families. They literally threw away more calories than entire neighbourhoods consumed. And get this, they had servants whose job was to ensure the leftover food was properly destroyed so it wouldn't end up feeding the poor, because that might encourage dependency. Now, have you ever wondered what poor Victorian families did when there simply was no food at all? The answer will haunt you. They practiced something called hunger management, essentially training their bodies to survive on nothing. Adults would tell children elaborate stories during meal times to distract them from the fact that there was no meal. They'd set empty plates on the table and pretend to eat, making exaggerated chewing motions so neighbours wouldn't know they had no food. The contrast in cooking methods tells its own horrifying story. Wealthy kitchens were technological marvels with coal-burning ranges, multiple ovens, ice houses for refrigeration, and specialised equipment for every possible cooking technique. Poor families, if they cooked at all, used shared communal ovens that they could rent by the hour. If they had money for both the rental and the fuel, here's something that will make you appreciate your kitchen. Wealthy Victorian homes had separate rooms for different types of food preparation. They had pastry rooms, meat preparation rooms, vegetable rooms, and even rooms specifically for arranging fruit. Some had wine cellars with temperature control systems that were more sophisticated than most modern homes. Poor families were grateful if they had a single pot that didn't leak. Let me share a story that perfectly captures this madness. In 1846, during the Irish potato famine, Lord Lucan threw a harvest festival dinner that cost $3,000. The irony. His own Irish tenants were literally dying of starvation on his estates, while he celebrated the abundance of the harvest with imported delicacies. The menu included 40 different dishes, none of which contained potatoes, because potatoes were considered peasant food, unworthy of his table. But here's what's truly mind-bending about Victorian food culture. The wealthy actually believed that poor people preferred simple food. They genuinely thought that working families chose to eat bread and water because they lacked the refined palates to appreciate fine cuisine. This wasn't just ignorance. It was willful delusion that allowed them to sleep comfortably in their silk sheets, while children starved outside their gates. The beverage situation was equally insane. Wealthy Victorians drank imported wines that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a month. They had port from Portugal, champagne from France, and brandy aged longer than most poor people lived. Poor families drank whatever water they could find, often contaminated with sewage and industrial waste. Tea was such a luxury for the poor that they would reuse the same tea leaves for days until they produced nothing but brown water. And let's talk about dining etiquette for a moment, because this reveals just how different these worlds were. Wealthy Victorians had rules for everything: which fork to use for fish, how to properly hold a soup spoon, the correct way to cut meat. They employed etiquette instructors and had books dedicated to proper dining behaviour. Poor families had one rule: if you found food, you ate it immediately before someone else could take it. Here's a detail that shows the absurdity of wealthy Victorian dining. They had courses specifically designed to cleanse the palate between other courses. Imagine being so privileged that you need to eat special food to prepare for eating other food. Meanwhile, poor children's palates were cleansed by hunger because there was nothing to dirty them with. These seasonal eating patterns reveal another layer of inequality. Wealthy families ate fresh fruits and vegetables year-round, thanks to heated greenhouses and imported goods. They had strawberries in winter and grapes in spring, all maintained by armies of gardeners. Poor families ate seasonally by necessity, and winter food often meant no food at all. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Victorian food inequality was the psychological impact. Wealthy children grew up expecting abundance, developing tastes for exotic foods and complex preparations. They learned to see food as entertainment, as art, as a way to display status. Poor children grew up grateful for crumbs, developing survival instincts around food that would last their entire short lives. As we've discovered, Victorian England didn't just have food inequality, it had two completely different relationships with food itself. The wealthy used food as a weapon of status, while the poor used every ounce of creativity just to survive another day. If you think the food disparities were extreme, wait until you see how these two worlds dressed. The fashion choices of the wealthy versus the clothing reality of the poor will reveal a level of inequality so visual, so immediately obvious, that it became a form of social control. What people wore didn't just reflect their status, it literally determined how they were treated, where they could go, and whether they lived or died. Picture the moment when Lady Victoria Wellesley steps out of her carriage at Hyde Park in 1848. The first thing that catches your eye isn't her face, it's her dress. A masterpiece of silk taffeta imported from Lyon, France, featuring 40 yards of fabric hand-embroidered with silver thread. The dress alone cost $300, enough money to clothe an entire working-class family for 20 years. But here's what will absolutely shock you. She'll wear this dress exactly once, because in wealthy Victorian society, being seen in the same outfit twice was considered social suicide. Now, at that exact moment, just across the park, 10-year-old Annie Fletcher is wrapping her feet in newspaper because she has no shoes. Her dress is actually a potato sack with holes cut for her arms and head. She's worn it every day for 8 months because it's the only clothing she owns. When it finally falls apart, she'll take it from another child, probably one who's died, because in the slums clothing was often inherited through death. But let me tell you about something that will blow your mind. Wealthy Victorian women didn't even dress themselves. They employed personal maids whose full-time job was managing their wardrobes. These weren't just any maids either. They were specialists who understood the complex rules of Victorian fashion. Because get this, there were literally books published about what to wear at what time of day. Morning dress, afternoon dress, tea dress, dinner dress, evening dress, and ball dress were all completely different, with specific rules about colours, fabrics, and accessories. Here's where this gets absolutely insane. A wealthy Victorian woman could own over 200 dresses, each worn only once or twice per season. Lady Londonderry's wardrobe inventory from 1845 lists 347 dresses, 89 pairs of shoes, and 156 hats. The total value? $15,000, enough to buy 50 decent homes for working families. And here's the kicker. She complained in her diary about having nothing suitable to wear. Now contrast that with the reality of poor clothing, and prepare to have your heart broken. Working families owned so few clothes that washing day was a strategic military operation. They had to time it perfectly because while their one set of clothes was drying, they literally had nothing else to wear. Children would huddle naked under whatever rags they could find, sometimes for days, waiting for their only outfit to dry. But here's a detail that shows just how different these worlds were. Wealthy Victorian women wore undergarments that were more expensive than anything poor people would ever own. A single corset, handmade by French seamstresses, could cost $50. That's more than a working man's annual salary, and they weren't wearing just one layer. Wealthy women wore up to 7 different undergarments: chemise, drawers, corset, bustle, crinoline, petticoat and stockings. Poor women. They were lucky if they had underwear at all. Let me tell you about something called mourning clothes that perfectly illustrates Victorian fashion insanity. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria established strict mourning dress codes that the wealthy followed religiously. Full mourning required completely black outfits for 2 years, then half mourning with limited colours for another year. Wealthy families would spend thousands of pounds on mourning wardrobes for a single death. Poor families couldn't afford mourning clothes, so they were often accused of not properly grieving their dead, as if the depth of your sorrow could be measured by the cost of your clothing. And speaking of black clothes, here's something that will amaze you. Wealthy Victorians had different shades of black for different occasions. Funeral black, church black, social black, and evening black were all distinct colours with specific fabric requirements. They employed colour specialists to ensure their blacks were appropriate. Meanwhile, poor people were grateful for any colour at all, even if it came from wearing other people's cast-offs. Now, have you ever wondered how wealthy Victorian women even moved in their clothes? The answer is they barely could. A full formal dress could weigh up to 30 pounds and require 2 people to help the wearer sit down. The crinoline skirts were so wide that women couldn't fit through doorways without turning sideways. But here's the twisted part. This immobility was the point. Being unable to work was a status symbol that proved you were wealthy enough not to need to. Poor women's clothing told a completely different story. Their clothes were designed for survival, not style. They wore layers of whatever they could find: old newspapers, rags, scraps of fabric, anything to stay warm. Their fashion was determined by what they could scavenge, steal, or inherit from the dead. Here's a shocking detail about children's clothing that will make you grateful for modern times. Wealthy Victorian children had separate outfits for every activity. Play clothes, study clothes, dining clothes, church clothes, visiting clothes, and sleeping clothes were all different. Some wealthy children changed clothes 5 times a day. Poor children wore the same outfit until it literally disintegrated from their bodies. But the most heartbreaking aspect of Victorian clothing inequality was the psychological impact. Clothing wasn't just about staying warm or looking nice. It was a passport to society. If you wore the wrong clothes, you were literally banned from certain areas of the city. Poor people couldn't enter shops, churches, or public buildings because their clothing marked them as undesirable. Clothing became a form of social control that kept the classes completely separated. Let me share a story that perfectly captures this madness. In 1847, the Duchess of Sutherland decided to redecorate her wardrobe. Not her room, her actual clothes. She hired teams of seamstresses to add new embellishments to dresses she'd worn once. The project took 6 months and cost $2,000. That same year, her estate records show that 143 families were evicted from their homes for being unable to pay rent that totaled $89. She spent more on decorating old clothes than it would have cost to house all those families for years. The shoe situation reveals another layer of this inequality that's almost too absurd to believe. Wealthy Victorian women owned shoes for every conceivable occasion. Morning shoes, afternoon shoes, dancing shoes, walking shoes, riding shoes, even shoes specifically for getting in and out of carriages. Some owned over 100 pairs. Poor people walked barefoot or wrapped their feet in whatever they could find. Newspapers, rags, even animal skins scavenged from butchers. Here's something that will blow your mind about Victorian fashion accessories. Wealthy women wore jewellery worth more than entire neighbourhoods. A single necklace owned by the Countess of Derby was valued at $25,000, enough to build housing for 500 families. They had jewellery for day, jewellery for evening, jewellery for morning, and jewellery for travel. Poor women wore whatever bits of metal or glass they could find, often pieces broken off from wealthy people's discarded items. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Victorian clothing was the labour behind it. Those beautiful silk dresses were often sewn by women and children working 18-hour days in sweatshops, earning pennies while creating garments worth fortunes. The seamstresses who made clothing for the wealthy were themselves often so poor they couldn't afford to buy the simplest version of what they created. The seasonal wardrobe changes of the wealthy were like elaborate theatrical productions. Entire teams of servants would spend weeks transitioning from winter to summer wardrobes, carefully storing hundreds of garments with special protective measures. Poor families had one set of clothes for all seasons, if they were lucky enough to have a complete set at all. And here's a detail that shows the sheer waste of wealthy Victorian fashion. Many expensive dresses were worn once and then stored forever, because fashion changed so rapidly that last season's style was considered embarrassing. Closets in wealthy homes were essentially museums of outdated fashion. while poor people died from exposure because they had no clothes to keep them warm. As we've seen, Victorian clothing wasn't just about fashion. It was about creating visible markers of inequality so stark that your social status could be determined from 100 yards away. The fabric on your back literally determined your place in society. But if you think the clothing disparities were shocking, wait until you discover how these two worlds approached education and childhood. What happened to children in Victorian England, the opportunities given to some and the futures stolen from others, will reveal perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this inequality. The difference between a wealthy child's day and a poor child's reality will change everything you think you know about childhood itself. It's 7 a.m. on a crisp October morning in 1842, and two 10-year-old boys are beginning their days in Victorian England. But what happens next will shatter every assumption you have about childhood, education, and human potential. Young Lord Edward Fitzwilliam wakes up in his silk pyjamas, in a bedroom larger than most people's entire homes, where his personal tutor is already waiting with lessons in Latin, Greek and French. Meanwhile, in the coal mines of Wales, 10-year-old Thomas Davies has been working underground for 3 hours already. Crawling through tunnels so narrow that grown men can't fit, his only education learning which sounds mean the mine is about to collapse. But here's what will absolutely stagger you. The cost of young Lord Edward's education for 1 year could have provided basic schooling for 2,000 children like Thomas. We're talking about $500 annually for private tutors, compared to the penny per week that working families couldn't afford for their children's education. The wealthy didn't just have better educational opportunities, they had access to knowledge that was literally forbidden to the poor. Let me paint you a picture of what education looked like for the wealthy, because the numbers are so extreme they sound fictional. Eton College, where the sons of the elite were educated, charged fees equivalent to $50,000 per year in today's money. But that was just tuition. Add the costs of uniforms, books, pocket money and additional lessons, and you're looking at what a working man would earn in 50 years of labour. The library at Eton contained 40,000 books, more books than most poor children would see in their entire lifetimes. Now let's step into the other world, and I promise what you're about to hear will haunt you. Parliamentary investigations from the 1840s documented children as young as 5 years old working 16-hour days in textile factories. Their classroom was a deafening industrial floor where the only lesson was survival. They learned to tie broken threads while machines were still running, to stay awake despite exhaustion that would break most adults, and to duck when the overseer's whip came their way. But here's where this gets truly heartbreaking. Many working-class parents desperately wanted to educate their children, but faced an impossible choice: send them to school and watch the family starve, or send them to work and watch their dreams die. A child's weekly wages of 3 shillings often meant the difference between the family eating or not. Education was a luxury they literally couldn't afford to want. Here's a detail that will blow your mind about wealthy children's education. They had teachers for everything. Not just academic subjects, but specialised instructors for dancing, riding, fencing, music, art, languages, and even deportment. Essentially how to walk and sit properly. Young aristocrats might have 8 different tutors, each earning more than most working fathers made in a year. Meanwhile, poor children taught themselves to read by studying discarded newspapers they found in gutters, if they were lucky enough to find any. Let me tell you about something called dame schools that reveals the desperate hunger for education among the poor. These were informal schools run by working-class women in their own homes, charging a penny per week per child. The classrooms were kitchen tables, the books were whatever scraps of paper they could find, and the teachers were often barely literate themselves. But here's what's beautiful about this. Despite having almost nothing, these communities created education from sheer determination. But the most shocking aspect isn't just the difference in quality, it's the difference in purpose. Wealthy children were educated to rule, to inherit estates, to make decisions that would affect thousands of lives. They studied history, philosophy, and classics because they were expected to lead society. Poor children, if they received any education at all, were taught just enough to be useful labourers. Basic arithmetic so they could count money, simple reading so they could follow instructions, nothing more. Have you ever wondered what happened to brilliant children born into poverty? The answer will break your heart. Intelligence meant nothing without opportunity. There are documented cases of working-class children who taught themselves advanced mathematics by studying the patterns in factory machinery, or who memorized entire books after hearing them read once. But their talents were wasted in mines and mills because society had no mechanism for recognizing or developing ability that wasn't born into wealth. Here's something that perfectly illustrates the insanity of this system. Wealthy families hired reading companions for their children, educated adults whose job was to read aloud to young aristocrats to save them the effort of reading themselves. Meanwhile, poor children would walk miles to borrow a single book, treasuring it like gold because it might be the only book they'd ever hold. The language barrier was another form of educational inequality that's almost impossible to believe. Wealthy children learned multiple languages. French was considered essential. Latin and Greek were standard, and many also studied German or Italian. They were literally taught to communicate with educated people across Europe. Poor children often couldn't even speak proper English, their regional dialects marking them as lower class and excluding them from better opportunities. Let me share a story that captures this educational tragedy perfectly. In 1845, a parliamentary commissioner discovered a 12-year-old girl named Mary Barrett working in a match factory. When asked if she could read, she said she'd taught herself by studying the labels on matchboxes. The commissioner tested her and found she could read better than many wealthy children her age. But Mary would spend her entire short life in that factory, her potential wasted because education was a privilege she was born without. But here's what's truly mind-bending. The wealthy actually believed that educating the poor was dangerous. They genuinely feared that if working-class children learned too much, they might start questioning why society was organized the way it was. There were serious parliamentary debates about whether teaching the poor to read might make them dissatisfied with their station in life. The physical environment of education tells its own story of inequality. Wealthy children studied in libraries with soaring ceilings, imported furniture, and thousands of books. Their classrooms had fireplaces, comfortable seating, and windows that let in natural light. Poor children who were lucky enough to attend school did so in basements, converted stables, or other people's kitchens, often sitting on bare floors in rooms without heat or adequate light. Here's a detail that shows the absurdity of wealthy education. Some aristocratic children had practice schools built on their family estates where they could play at being teachers with carefully selected local children acting as students. They were literally practicing ruling over others as a form of education. Meanwhile, real poor children were practicing survival skills that no child should ever need to learn. The contrast in educational materials is equally shocking. Wealthy children had books bound in leather, printed on fine paper, with beautiful illustrations. They had globes, maps, scientific instruments, and art supplies. Poor children shared slate boards, used chalk made from actual chalk cliffs, and considered a pencil a precious luxury. Many learned to write by practicing in sand or dirt because paper was too expensive. But perhaps the most tragic aspect was what we'd now call lost potential. Government surveys from the 1840s estimated that less than 30% of working-class children could read their own names. Think about that. We'll never know how many potential scientists, artists, writers, or leaders died in poverty because they were never given the chance to develop their abilities. The Wealthy Children's Grand Tour, a year-long educational journey through Europe after finishing school, cost more than most families would see in a lifetime. They visited museums, learned from famous scholars, and experienced different cultures. Poor Children's Tour consisted of whatever they could see from the factory windows during their brief breaks from work. And here's something that will make you appreciate modern education. Wealthy Victorian families often hired conversation partners, educated adults whose job was to engage children in stimulating discussion to develop their thinking skills. These weren't teachers in the traditional sense. They were professional intellectual companions. Poor children had no such luxury. Their conversations were limited to whatever they could overhear from adults too exhausted from work to engage with them. As we've discovered, Victorian education wasn't just about learning. It was about determining who would have the tools to succeed and who would be trapped in poverty forever. The knowledge gap wasn't just about books and lessons. It was about creating two completely different types of human beings. But if you think the educational divide was the cruelest aspect of Victorian inequality, wait until you discover what happened when these two worlds got sick. The difference between wealthy and poor medical care will reveal inequalities so stark, so literally life and death, that they challenge everything you think you know about the value of human life. When illness strikes in Victorian England, the response reveals the most brutal truth about inequality yet. The Earl of Derby develops a fever, and within hours 3 of London's finest physicians are at his bedside. They prescribe imported mineral water, bed rest in silk sheets, and medicines that cost more than most people earn in a month. 2 weeks later, he's fully recovered. That same week, in the slums of Manchester, 8-year-old William Thompson develops the exact same fever. No doctor comes. No medicine arrives. William dies 3 days later, one of 17 children who perish on his street that month from completely preventable diseases. Here's what will absolutely shock you about Victorian medical care. The wealthy didn't just receive better treatment, they lived in a completely different medical reality. When Lord Byron's daughter fell ill in 1847, her family employed 5 different specialists, each focusing on a different aspect of her condition. They had a general physician, a specialist in children's diseases, a dietary consultant, a pharmacist who prepared custom medicines, and even a therapeutic companion whose job was to keep her spirits up during recovery. The total cost for her care, $200, more than a working family's combined income for 4 years. Now let me tell you what medical care looked like for the poor, and I promise it will haunt you. The only doctor most working-class families ever saw was the coroner who came to confirm their deaths. When poor people got sick, they had 3 options: pray they get better on their own, visit a street corner quack selling dangerous concoctions, or simply wait to die. There were no other choices. But here's where this gets truly heartbreaking. Wealthy Victorians had access to genuine medical innovations that could have saved thousands of poor lives, but these treatments were essentially kept secret from the working class. Anesthesia, for example, was available for wealthy patients undergoing surgery from the 1840s onward. Poor people, they bit down on leather straps and prayed they'd pass out from the pain before the surgeon finished cutting. Let me share some numbers that will blow your mind about the medical inequality. A single consultation with a prominent London physician cost 2 guineas. That's about $400 today. For that same amount of money, a working family could eat for 6 months. Surgery performed by a skilled doctor could cost $50 or more. For perspective, that was more than most working men earned in an entire year. So when poor people needed surgery, they either went without or visited back-alley butchers who were more likely to kill them than cure them. Here's something that perfectly illustrates Victorian medical insanity. Wealthy families employed personal pharmacists who would create custom medicines tailored to each family member's specific needs. These weren't just any medicines either. They were often imported ingredients mixed, according to recipes developed specifically for that household. Meanwhile, poor families shared bottles of patent medicines that were mostly alcohol mixed with opium, sold by travelling salesmen who promised they could cure everything from toothaches to tuberculosis. But the most shocking aspect of Victorian medical care wasn't just the quality difference. It was the fundamental belief that poor people's lives were worth less. Medical textbooks from the era actually taught that the poor had inferior constitutions that made them naturally more susceptible to disease and less likely to recover from treatment. This wasn't ignorance. It was willful justification for providing substandard care to those who couldn't pay. Have you ever wondered what happened to poor women during childbirth in Victorian times? The answer will break your heart. Wealthy women gave birth attended by trained physicians in sterile environments with access to pain relief and emergency interventions. Their mortality rate was around 5 per 1,000 births. Poor women gave birth with untrained midwives in filthy conditions with no medical support whatsoever. Their mortality rate, over 40 per 1,000 births. Being poor during childbirth was essentially a death sentence that wealthy women never faced. Here's a detail that shows the absurdity of wealthy Victorian medical care. Some aristocratic families employed resident physicians who lived on their estates year-round, providing medical care exclusively to that one family. These doctors were often some of the most skilled practitioners in England, dedicating their entire careers to keeping a handful of wealthy people healthy. Meanwhile, entire poor neighbourhoods shared a single overworked doctor who might see hundreds of patients per day, if they were lucky enough to have any medical care at all. Let me tell you about something called medical tourism that perfectly captures this inequality. Wealthy Victorians who felt unwell would travel to spas in Germany, take healing waters in Italy, or visit specialists in Switzerland. They turned medical care into luxury vacations, spending more on a single therapeutic trip than most families would see in a lifetime. Poor people with the same illnesses simply died where they were born, never having travelled more than a few miles from their homes. The contrast in medical facilities is equally shocking. Wealthy patients recovered in private hospitals that resembled luxury hotels, with individual rooms, imported furnishings and gourmet meals prepared by professional chefs. These facilities had the latest medical equipment, libraries for patient entertainment, and gardens for therapeutic walks. Poor patients who were lucky enough to receive any hospital care were crammed into workhouse infirmaries where dozens of people shared single rooms, often lying on straw mattresses crawling with vermin. But here's what's truly mind-bending about Victorian medical inequality. The wealthy actually had access to preventive care that could have eliminated most diseases affecting the poor. They had regular health examinations, dietary consultations, and lifestyle recommendations that kept them healthy. They understood concepts like hygiene, nutrition, and exercise because they could afford to learn about them. Poor people had no access to this knowledge and often died from conditions that were completely preventable. Here's a story that perfectly illustrates this medical madness. In 1854, during a cholera outbreak in London, Dr. John Snow famously traced the disease to contaminated water from a specific pump in Soho. But here's what most people don't know. Wealthy neighbourhoods had already switched to clean water sources years earlier because they could afford to. The cholera outbreak primarily killed poor people who had no choice but to drink contaminated water. The wealthy watched the epidemic from their safe, clean neighbourhoods, protected by privileges they'd purchased with money. The medicine cabinet of a wealthy Victorian home was like a modern pharmacy. They had imported herbs, custom-mixed tonics, pain relievers made from high-quality ingredients, and even early forms of antibiotics. Poor families, if they had any medicines at all, relied on home remedies made from whatever plants they could find growing wild, often with disastrous results, because they had no understanding of proper dosages or drug interactions. And let's talk about mental health for a moment, because the disparity here is almost too cruel to believe. Wealthy people experiencing mental health issues were sent to private sanitariums that resembled luxury resorts, with beautiful grounds, excellent food, and dignified treatment designed to restore their health. Poor people with mental health problems were locked in public asylums that were essentially prisons, where they were chained, beaten, and displayed to paying visitors as entertainment. Here's a detail that shows how different these medical worlds were. Wealthy Victorian families had health diaries, where they recorded every family member's daily wellness, noting diet, exercise, mood, and any symptoms. They treated health like a science project, carefully monitoring and adjusting their lifestyle to maintain optimal wellness. Poor families had no time or knowledge for such luxury. They worked until they collapsed and hoped for the best. The surgical options available to the wealthy versus the poor reveal another layer of this inequality that's almost impossible to believe. Wealthy patients had access to the finest surgeons using the best instruments in sterile environments. They received proper anesthesia, skilled nursing care, and extended recovery periods. Poor people needing surgery often ended up on kitchen tables with butchers who'd learned their trade in army field hospitals, using dirty tools and no pain relief. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Victorian medical inequality was the psychological impact on families. Wealthy parents never had to watch their children die from preventable diseases because they could afford prevention and treatment. Poor parents lived with the constant terror that any minor illness could kill their children, and they were powerless to stop it. The grief and helplessness must have been unbearable. As we've seen, Victorian medical care wasn't just about healing the sick. It was about determining who deserved to live and who was expendable. The treatment you received when you were most vulnerable revealed society's true values about human worth. But if you think the medical inequalities were the most shocking aspect of Victorian life, wait until you discover how these two worlds actually spent their days. The difference between a wealthy person's daily routine and a poor person's struggle for survival will reveal the true human cost of this inequality, and show you just how completely different two lives could be while sharing the same city, the same air, and supposedly the same humanity. The sun rises over London in 1845, and as the first light touches the city, two completely different versions of human existence begin to unfold. Lord Pemberton awakens at 9 a.m. to the gentle sound of his valet drawing silk curtains, beginning a day so leisurely it resembles a vacation. At that exact moment, 12-year-old Sarah Jenkins is already 5 hours into her workday in a Manchester cotton mill where the deafening machinery has permanently damaged her hearing and the cotton dust is slowly destroying her lungs. But here's what will absolutely stagger you. Lord Pemberton will accomplish less in his entire day than Sarah accomplishes before noon, yet he'll earn more money lying in bed than she'll make in 10 years of backbreaking labour. Let me take you inside a typical day for the wealthy, because the sheer pointlessness of it will blow your mind. Lord Pemberton's morning routine begins with a leisurely bath drawn by servants, followed by a breakfast that takes 2 hours to consume, not because there's that much food, but because eating slowly is considered refined. After breakfast, He might spend an hour deciding which horse to ride, another hour actually riding, and then the remainder of his morning recovering from the exhaustion of making such difficult decisions. Now contrast that with Sarah's reality, and prepare to have your heart shattered. She's been awake since 4 a.m, not by choice, but because the factory bell determines when her life begins and ends. Her breakfast is a crust of bread eaten while standing at her machine, because stopping for even a moment could cost her the day's wages that her family desperately needs to survive. By the time Lord Pemberton is deciding which cufflinks to wear, Sarah has already tied thousands of broken threads in conditions that would be considered torture by today's standards. But here's where this gets truly insane. The wealthy actually believed they were working harder than the poor because their decisions were more important. Lord Pemberton's diary from 1847, discovered in family archives, includes this entry. Exhausted today from choosing between the bay mare and the chestnut gelding for my morning ride. Such weighty decisions require considerable mental effort. That same day, factory records show that Sarah worked 16 consecutive hours without a break, handling machinery that could have killed her instantly if she'd made a single mistake. Here's something that will blow your mind about wealthy Victorian daily schedules. They had servants whose only job was to manage their free time. Social secretaries would plan their leisure activities, entertainment coordinators would arrange their amusements, and schedule managers would ensure they weren't overwhelmed by too much relaxation. Meanwhile, poor people worked such long hours that they measured their lives not in days or weeks, but in the brief moments between sleeping and working. Let me tell you about the Victorian concept of leisure time for the wealthy, because it's so excessive it sounds fictional. A typical aristocrat's afternoon might include an hour of letter writing, dictated to a secretary, a 2-hour lunch, with wines from 3 different countries, an afternoon nap, a leisurely stroll through their private gardens, and perhaps some light reading before preparing for the evening's entertainment. Poor people had no concept of leisure time. They had work time and sleep time, and nothing else existed. Now, have you ever wondered what happened during those rare moments when working people weren't actually working? The answer reveals another layer of this inequality that's almost too cruel to believe. Poor families spent their free time trying to survive, mending their only set of clothes, searching for fuel to stay warm, or walking miles to find cheaper food. What the wealthy called leisure, the poor called additional unpaid labour necessary for survival. Here's a detail that perfectly captures the absurdity of wealthy Victorian work habits. Many aristocrats employed morning readers, servants who would read newspapers aloud to them because reading was considered too strenuous an activity before noon. They literally paid people to prevent them from the exhaustion of reading. Meanwhile, poor people who were literate treasured every scrap of written material they could find, often reading by candlelight after 18-hour workdays. But the most shocking aspect of Victorian working life wasn't just the hours, it was the life expectancy based on occupation. Bankers and landlords who spent their days in comfortable offices lived an average of 45 years. Coal miners, who worked in conditions that defied human imagination, lived an average of 17 years. The wealthy weren't just living better lives, they were living 3 times longer because their work didn't actually require them to work. Let me share a story that illustrates this perfectly. The Earl of Derby kept a detailed journal of his daily activities in 1844. His entry for July 15th reads, "Rose at 10, breakfast until noon, examined the roses in the south garden, napped, wrote 2 letters, dinner party for 12. That same day, government labour inspectors documented children as young as 6 working 19-hour shifts in his own textile factories, some collapsing from exhaustion and being carried out unconscious. Here's something that will make you appreciate your current job situation. Wealthy Victorians often complained about being overworked when they had social obligations more than 3 days per week. Lady Catherine Pemberton wrote in her diary, "Simply exhausted. We've had dinner parties on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. I fear I may collapse from the strain of so much socializing." Meanwhile, working people laboured 7 days a week, often taking their only day off when they were too sick to stand. The contrast in workplace conditions reveals another dimension of this inequality that's almost impossible to comprehend. Wealthy men's offices were often luxurious studies in their own homes, complete with fireplaces, comfortable chairs, expensive artwork, and servants who brought refreshments throughout the day. Working people's offices were factories filled with dangerous machinery, mine shafts that regularly collapsed, or construction sites where safety equipment didn't exist. But here's what's truly mind-bending about Victorian work culture. The wealthy genuinely believed that their lifestyle was more stressful than manual labour because of the mental burden of managing wealth. They hired entire teams of advisors, accountants and managers to handle their money, then complained about the exhaustion of supervising these teams. Poor people managed their own finances out of necessity, which usually meant calculating whether they could afford to eat that day. Here's a detail that shows how completely disconnected these worlds were. Wealthy Victorians had seasonal schedules that moved them between different homes throughout the year. Spring in London, summer at the country estate, autumn in Scotland, winter in Italy. Their biggest work challenge was coordinating which servants would travel with them to which location. Poor people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, often in the same room for their entire lives. The daily calorie expenditure tells its own story of inequality. Studies from the period show that wealthy Victorians consumed an average of 3,500 calories per day, while expending about 1,800 in gentle activities. Poor workers consumed around 500 calories per day, while expending over 4,000 in back-breaking labour. The wealthy were literally eating themselves into obesity, while the poor starved themselves into exhaustion. And let's talk about the concept of sick days for a moment, because the contrast is almost too brutal to discuss. When wealthy people felt unwell, they took to their beds for weeks, attended by personal physicians and served gourmet meals to restore their strength. When poor people got sick, they continued working because missing a single day's wages could mean their families didn't eat. There are documented cases of people working until they literally dropped dead at their stations. Here's something that perfectly illustrates the insanity of this system. Wealthy Victorian men often hired conversation partners for their daily walks, educated companions whose job was to provide stimulating discussion during exercise. They were literally too important to walk alone. Poor people walked miles every day just to get to work, often in painful shoes or barefoot, with no one to talk to except their own exhausted thoughts. The retirement situation reveals perhaps the cruelest aspect of this working inequality. Wealthy Victorians retired whenever they felt like it, often in their 30s or 40s, to lives of complete leisure supported by inherited wealth. Poor people worked until they physically couldn't continue, then died in workhouses if they were lucky, or on the streets if they weren't. The concept of retirement simply didn't exist for working people, but perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Victorian working life was the psychological toll on families. Wealthy parents had unlimited time to spend with their children, creating bonds and memories that lasted lifetimes. Poor parents saw their children so rarely. Everyone was working such long hours that families became strangers living in the same cramped space, connected by shared suffering rather than shared joy. As we've seen, Victorian working life wasn't just about having different jobs. It was about living in completely different versions of reality where time, effort, and human dignity had entirely different meanings depending on the circumstances of your birth. But if you think the daily work inequalities were extreme, wait until you discover how these two worlds approached love, marriage, and family life. The difference between wealthy romance and poor survival will reveal truths about human relationships that are both beautiful and heartbreaking, and show you how even the most intimate aspects of life were shaped by the brutal mathematics of Victorian inequality. Two couples stand at the altar in Victorian England, both speaking the same vows but living in completely different universes of love. Lady Margaret Ashworth's wedding to the Duke of Marlborough is a $50,000 spectacle featuring 800 guests, imported flowers from 3 countries, and a cake that cost more than most people's homes. Yet she's never spent a moment alone with her groom, barely knows his first name, and their marriage was arranged by lawyers over brandy and cigars 6 months earlier. Meanwhile, in a tiny church across London, millworker Thomas Fletcher marries his beloved Mary after a courtship filled with stolen moments, secret letters, and genuine affection. But their entire wedding costs less than Lady Margaret's bouquet, and they'll spend their honeymoon in the same cramped room where Thomas's entire family lives. Here's what will absolutely blow your mind about Victorian marriage. The wealthy had everything money could buy except the one thing the poor had in abundance: the freedom to marry for love. Aristocratic marriages were business mergers disguised as romance, where families negotiated dowries like stock transactions, and compatibility was measured in acres of land rather than genuine affection. The irony is almost too perfect. Those with unlimited resources to create romantic lives were forbidden from experiencing romance, while those with nothing could give their hearts freely. Let me paint you a picture of wealthy courtship that's so calculated it sounds like a business proposal, because essentially that's exactly what it was. When Lord Spencer decided his son needed a wife in 1846, he hired a marriage broker. Yes, that was an actual profession, to compile a list of suitable candidates. The criteria had nothing to do with personality or attraction. It was all about dowry size, family connections, and breeding potential. Romance was not just discouraged. It was considered dangerous because it might interfere with sound financial judgment. Now let's step into the other world, where love bloomed in the most unlikely places despite impossible circumstances. Poor couples courted in factory lunch breaks, walking together for precious 15-minute intervals between shifts. They wrote love letters on scraps of paper salvaged from trash. Because buying writing paper was an unaffordable luxury, their romance was built on stolen glances across crowded workrooms, shared crusts of bread, and whispered promises of better days that both knew might never come. But here's where this gets truly heartbreaking. Working-class couples often had to choose between love and survival. Marriage meant combining 2 poverty-level incomes, which might allow them to rent a slightly larger room, but also meant more mouths to feed when children inevitably arrived. Many couples postponed marriage for years, even decades, saving every penny for the basic necessities of starting a family. Some never married at all, not from lack of love, but from economic impossibility. Here's a detail that will stagger you about wealthy Victorian weddings. They were planned like military campaigns, with professional coordinators managing every detail months in advance. The wedding of Lady Caroline Ponsonby in 1847 required 200 servants, 50 musicians and catering staff transported from London to the family estate in Scotland. The flowers alone cost $3,000, enough money to support 50 working families for an entire year. Yet the bride and groom had spoken fewer than 50 words to each other before their wedding day. The contrast in wedding costs reveals an inequality so extreme it defies belief. A typical working-class wedding cost around 10 shillings, basically a week's wages for the groom. This might cover a simple ceremony, perhaps a modest celebration with immediate family, and if they were very fortunate, a new dress for the bride made from the cheapest available fabric. Wealthy weddings routinely cost thousands of pounds, featuring custom gowns that took seamstresses months to create, using fabrics imported from across the globe. Now, have you ever wondered what happened after these very different weddings? The contrast in married life is almost too stark to believe. Wealthy couples often lived such separate lives that they scheduled appointments to see each other. They had different bedrooms, different social circles, and sometimes different homes entirely. Many aristocratic marriages were conducted entirely through servants, with husbands and wives communicating by written notes delivered by footmen. Poor couples, crowded into single rooms with multiple generations of family, experienced a kind of forced intimacy that would have horrified the wealthy. They shared everything: space, food, worries, dreams, not by choice, but by necessity. Yet paradoxically, this forced closeness often created deeper emotional bonds than the wealthy ever experienced in their palatial isolation. Here's something that perfectly illustrates the twisted nature of wealthy Victorian marriage. Many aristocratic couples hired conversation facilitators for their dinner parties because they literally didn't know how to talk to each other. These were professional entertainers whose job was to prevent awkward silences between husbands and wives who were essentially strangers living in the same house. Meanwhile, poor couples treasured every moment they could spend talking together, often their only escape from the brutality of daily survival. The pregnancy and childbirth experiences reveal another layer of this marriage inequality that's almost too cruel to discuss. Wealthy women had teams of specialists, private hospitals, and months of bed rest before and after delivery. They were pampered through pregnancy like fragile flowers, with every comfort money could provide. Poor women worked until the moment labour began, often giving birth with no medical assistance whatsoever, and returned to factory work within days because missing wages meant their families wouldn't eat. But here's what's truly mind-bending about Victorian marriage. The wealthy had so much money they could afford to be completely dysfunctional, while the poor had to function perfectly just to survive. Rich couples could live entirely separate lives, maintain multiple residences, and even have affairs with minimal consequences because their wealth provided unlimited options. Poor couples had to work together like a perfectly coordinated team because a single mistake or conflict could destroy their family's chance of survival. Let me share a story that captures this perfectly. The Earl and Countess of Pembroke, married in 1845, maintained separate social calendars, employed different servants, and often went months without seeing each other despite living in the same 200-room mansion. Their marriage was considered successful by Victorian standards because neither party caused public embarrassment. That same year, mill workers James and Ellen Morrison lost their first child to disease, spent their life savings on the funeral, and still had to return to work the next day to avoid eviction. Yet neighbours described them as devoted because they supported each other through tragedies that would have broken stronger people. The extramarital affair situations reveal the hypocrisy at the heart of Victorian marriage inequality. Wealthy men routinely kept mistresses, often installing them in separate households with their own servants and allowances. This was considered normal, even expected as long as they were discreet. Poor men who strayed from their marriages faced immediate social ostracism and economic ruin because their communities couldn't afford to support divided households or broken families. Here's a detail that shows how different these marriage worlds were. Wealthy couples exchanged gifts worth hundreds of pounds for anniversaries, birthdays, and holidays. The Duchess of Marlborough's jewellery collection includes anniversary gifts valued at over $30,000 in total. Poor couples celebrated special occasions by sharing slightly better food, or perhaps taking a rare evening walk together. Simple pleasures that cost nothing but meant everything, because they represented precious time stolen from the constant struggle for survival. The child-rearing approaches reveal perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Victorian marriage inequality. Wealthy parents employed teams of nannies, governesses, and tutors, seeing their children for brief, formal visits each day. They provided every material advantage while remaining emotionally distant. Poor parents desperately wanted to spend time with their children, but worked such brutal hours that family time was almost impossible. They could offer love and attention, but had no resources to provide security or opportunity. And here's something that will make you reconsider modern relationships. Poor Victorian couples often knew each other better after 1 year of marriage than wealthy couples knew each other after decades. Shared hardship, mutual dependence, and constant proximity created intimacy that no amount of money could purchase. The wealthy, with all their resources and opportunities, often lived lives of profound loneliness within their marriages. The divorce and separation realities tell their own story of inequality. Wealthy couples could afford legal separations, maintain separate households, or even obtain rare divorces through expensive parliamentary procedures. Poor couples who couldn't make their marriages work had no options. They simply had to endure because they couldn't afford alternatives. Some abandoned families entirely, disappearing into the anonymity of industrial cities, leaving behind spouses and children with no legal or financial recourse. As we've discovered, Victorian marriage wasn't just about finding love. It was about navigating completely different systems of human connection, where money determined not just how you lived, but how you loved, how you raised children, and whether you experienced genuine intimacy or lived in gilded isolation. But if you think the marriage inequalities were shocking, wait until you see how these two worlds move through their daily lives. The difference between wealthy and poor transportation will reveal an inequality so visible, so immediately obvious, that it became a form of mobile social control, determining not just how people travelled, but where they could go and who they could become. A golden carriage glides through London's streets in 1848, its wheels barely making a sound on the cobblestones thanks to specially designed suspension that costs more than most people earn in a lifetime. Inside, the Duke of Richmond reclines on velvet cushions, sipping imported wine from crystal glasses while his personal footman ensures the temperature remains perfect throughout the journey. The carriage itself, a masterpiece of craftsmanship featuring gold leaf, hand-carved details and silk interior, represents 3 years of wages for a skilled craftsman. Meanwhile, walking alongside this magnificent vehicle, young Timothy Walsh trudges barefoot through the same streets, his feet bleeding from the rough stones, carrying a 50-pound sack of coal on his back because at age 11 he is the family's only source of transportation for heavy goods. Here's what will absolutely stagger you about Victorian transportation. The wealthy didn't just travel differently. They existed in a completely separate reality of movement, where distance, time, and physical effort had entirely different meanings. The Duke's carriage can cover 20 miles in comfort that exceeds most modern luxury cars, while Timothy will walk those same 20 miles carrying loads that would challenge grown men, arriving exhausted, injured, and hours later. Let me paint you a picture of wealthy Victorian travel that's so extravagant it sounds like fantasy. When Lord Rothschild decided to visit his estate in Scotland in 1847, the journey required his personal train car. Yes, wealthy families owned private railway cars. A convoy of 6 carriages to transport luggage and servants, advanced teams to prepare rest stops along the route, and even a mobile kitchen car to ensure he could dine properly during the 12-hour journey. The cost of this single trip? $800, enough money to relocate 50 working families to better housing. Now let's step into the brutal reality of poor people's transportation, and I promise what you hear will haunt you. Working families measured distance not in miles but in hours of walking because walking was their only option. A trip that took wealthy people 30 minutes by carriage might require a full day's journey on foot for the poor. But here's the cruel irony. Poor people often had to travel farther than the wealthy because they couldn't afford to live near their workplaces, forcing them into exhausting daily commutes that consumed hours of their already limited time. But here's where this gets truly heartbreaking. Children as young as 6 years old became human transportation systems for their families. They carried water from distant wells, hauled coal from distribution points, and transported goods between family members working in different locations. These children walked an average of 15 miles per day, not for exercise or adventure, but because their family's survival depended on their small bodies serving as unpaid delivery services. Here's a detail that will blow your mind about wealthy Victorian transportation. They had different vehicles for different times of day and different social purposes. Morning carriages for business, afternoon carriages for social calls, evening carriages for entertainment, and special ceremonial carriages for important events. The Duke of Devonshire owned 17 different carriages, each requiring teams of horses, drivers, and maintenance staff. Poor families considered themselves incredibly fortunate if they could afford to ride in a public omnibus once in their entire lives. Let me tell you about something called carriage etiquette that perfectly illustrates the absurdity of wealthy transportation. Victorian society had strict rules about which direction you should face while riding, how to properly enter and exit a carriage, and even which hand to use when acknowledging other wealthy travellers. They employed etiquette instructors specifically for carriage behaviour. Meanwhile, poor people had one transportation rule: keep walking until you reach your destination, no matter how long it takes or how much it hurts. Now, have you ever wondered what happened when poor people absolutely needed to travel long distances? The answer reveals another layer of this inequality that's almost too cruel to believe. They walked, sometimes for days, carrying everything they owned on their backs. Parliamentary surveys from the 1840s documented families walking over 100 miles to find work, sleeping in fields, begging for water, and arriving at their destination so exhausted they could barely function. Many died during these journeys, their bodies found along roadsides, victims of a transportation system that simply ignored their existence. Here's something that perfectly captures the madness of Victorian transportation inequality. Wealthy families employed travel coordinators whose full-time job was planning journeys. These specialists would scout routes, arrange accommodations, coordinate timing, and ensure every detail of travel was perfect. A single trip might require months of planning and cost more than working families earned in years. Poor people's travel planning consisted of: start walking and hope you survive the journey. The horse situation tells its own shocking story of inequality. Wealthy Victorian families owned dozens of horses, each bred for specific purposes: riding horses, carriage horses, hunting horses, racing horses. These animals lived in stables that were more comfortable than most human housing, with individual stalls, premium feed, and dedicated grooms. The annual cost of maintaining a wealthy family's horses exceeded the combined income of entire working-class neighbourhoods. Poor people had never even touched a horse, let alone owned one. But here's what's truly mind-bending about Victorian transportation. The wealthy actually travelled slower than necessary because comfort was more important than speed. Their elaborate carriages with thick cushions and heavy suspensions were designed for luxury, not efficiency. They could afford to take scenic routes, make unnecessary stops, and extend journeys for pleasure. Poor people, when they could travel at all, moved as quickly as possible because every moment away from work meant lost wages and potential starvation. Here's a story that illustrates this perfectly. In 1846, Lady Catherine Pemberton wrote in her diary about a dreadfully uncomfortable journey to Bath that took 6 hours in her private carriage, complete with heated compartments and refreshment service. She complained bitterly about the inconvenience. That same week, factory worker Michael O'Brien walked 200 miles from Ireland to Manchester seeking work, a journey that took him 12 days, during which he ate only what he could beg or forage and slept in ditches when farmers wouldn't let him shelter in their barns. The railway revolution reveals perhaps the most visible form of Victorian transportation inequality. When trains first appeared, they literally built different classes of cars that mirrored society's structure. First-class carriages were luxurious parlours on wheels with comfortable seating, heating and refreshment service. Third-class carriages were essentially cattle cars, open wagons with wooden benches, no protection from weather and no amenities whatsoever. The wealthy rode in comfort while the poor were transported like cargo. And let's talk about sedan chairs for a moment, a form of transportation so ridiculous it perfectly captures aristocratic excess. Wealthy people would be carried through the streets by teams of strong men, essentially using human beings as living vehicles. This wasn't just about avoiding walking. It was about demonstrating that they could afford to treat other humans as beasts of burden. The chair carriers were often poor men who spent their entire working lives literally carrying the wealthy on their backs. Here's a detail that shows how completely different these transportation worlds were. Wealthy Victorian families had weather carriages for different climate conditions, enclosed carriages for rain, open carriages for sunshine, and specially designed vehicles for snow or wind. They never had to experience uncomfortable weather during travel. Poor people walked through every possible condition: blizzards, thunderstorms, scorching heat, because they had no alternatives. Weather wasn't something they could avoid. It was something they endured. The maintenance and storage of wealthy transportation was like a small industry. Great estates had coach houses that resembled palaces, with dozens of vehicles stored in climate-controlled environments, polished by teams of specialists, and maintained by expert craftsmen. These coach houses were often larger and more elaborate than entire working-class neighbourhoods. Poor people maintained their transportation, their feet, by wrapping them in whatever rags they could find and hoping for the best. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Victorian transportation inequality was the psychological impact on mobility and opportunity. Wealthy people could travel anywhere, any time, for any reason. The world was literally at their fingertips, accessible through a network of comfortable, rapid transportation options. Poor people were essentially prisoners of geography, trapped within walking distance of their birthplaces, unable to explore opportunities, visit distant family, or escape their circumstances because they simply couldn't afford to move. The luggage situation reveals another dimension of this inequality that's almost comical in its excess. Wealthy travellers required teams of servants just to manage their belongings, multiple trunks of clothing, travelling furniture, portable libraries, even travelling kitchen equipment. The luggage for a wealthy family's weekend trip often weighed more than everything a poor family owned combined. Poor people travelled with nothing because they owned nothing portable and valuable enough to take with them. As we've seen, Victorian transportation wasn't just about getting from place to place. It was about determining who could participate in the larger world and who would remain trapped in small circles of poverty, exhaustion, and limited opportunity. But if you think the transportation inequalities were extreme, wait until you discover how these two worlds spent their leisure time and sought entertainment. The difference between wealthy amusements and poor people's desperate search for any escape from their reality will reveal perhaps the most heartbreaking contrast yet, showing how even joy, laughter, and human pleasure became luxuries that only money could buy. The crystal chandelier illuminates the ballroom at Chatsworth House as 300 of England's wealthiest families gather for what they call entertainment. The Duke of Devonshire has spent $5,000, more than a working family's lifetime earnings, on a single evening's amusement featuring a full orchestra, imported champagne, and a menu of 20 courses prepared by French chefs. Ladies glide across marble floors in gowns worth more than houses, while gentlemen discuss philosophy and politics between hands of card games, where they casually wager amounts that could feed entire neighbourhoods. Yet at this exact moment, just 3 miles away in the gin palaces of Manchester, exhausted mill workers are drinking themselves into oblivion on watered-down spirits that cost a day's wages, seeking any escape from lives so brutal that temporary unconsciousness feels like the ultimate luxury. Here's what will absolutely blow your mind about Victorian entertainment. The wealthy didn't just have better amusements, they lived in a world where pleasure was a full-time occupation, while the poor had to steal moments of joy from the edges of survival. A single party thrown by aristocrats could employ more musicians than most poor people would hear perform in their entire lifetimes. Yet these elaborate entertainments were often described by attendees as dreadfully boring, because they had so much leisure time that even luxury became routine. Let me take you inside a typical wealthy Victorian evening, because the excess is so staggering it sounds like satire. When Lord Byron's daughter hosted a dinner party in 1847, the entertainment included a private performance by opera singers imported from Milan, professional storytellers, a magic show featuring equipment worth more than most people's homes, dancing masters to teach the latest steps, and even a poet laureate hired to compose verses specifically for the evening's guests. The cost: $3,000, enough to provide basic entertainment for 5,000 working families for an entire year. Now contrast that with poor people's desperate search for any escape from their reality, and prepare to have your heart broken. Working families gathered in cramped public houses where a penny could buy an hour of warmth and human companionship. Their entertainment consisted of sharing stories of better times, singing old songs that reminded them of home, or simply sitting together in grateful silence after 16-hour workdays. The highlight of their week might be a travelling performer who'd sing for coins, or a rare evening when someone could afford to buy a round of drinks for the group. But here's where this gets truly heartbreaking. Poor people often had to choose between food and fun, between survival and sanity. A working man's weekly entertainment budget might be 3p, just enough for a single mug of ale or a ticket to see a travelling circus. Yet even this tiny pleasure could mean his children went to bed hungry, creating guilt that turned what should have been joyful moments into moral dilemmas that wealthy people never faced. Here's a detail that perfectly captures the insanity of wealthy Victorian entertainment. They hired professional conversation facilitators for their parties because they were literally too bored by their own lives to generate interesting discussion. These entertainers were paid more for a single evening of chatting than working people earned in months of back-breaking labour. Meanwhile, poor families treasured any opportunity for conversation because their exhausting work schedules left little time for human connection. Let me tell you about something called grand tours that shows just how different these entertainment worlds were. Wealthy young people would spend entire years travelling across Europe, visiting museums, attending cultural events, and experiencing different societies, all as entertainment funded by their families. The cost of these educational pleasure trips could reach $10,000 per person. Poor people's equivalent of a grand tour was walking to a neighbouring town on their 1 day off per month, if they were lucky enough to have any time off at all. Now, have you ever wondered what passed for sports among these two classes? The contrast will stagger you. Wealthy Victorians engaged in elaborate hunting expeditions that required teams of servants, specially trained horses, and equipment worth fortunes. They hunted not for food, but for the thrill of killing animals they'd never eat, often travelling hundreds of miles to estates specifically maintained for their amusement. Poor people hunted for food scraps in gutters, competed in brutal boxing matches for pennies, or played makeshift games with whatever objects they could find. Here's something that will blow your mind about wealthy Victorian entertainment budgets. Some aristocratic families spent more on a single evening's fireworks display than entire working-class communities earned in a year. The Earl of Derby's 1848 New Year's celebration featured pyrotechnics that cost $2,000 and lasted just 20 minutes. That same amount of money could have provided basic entertainment, a weekly dance, storytelling, or musical evening for 2,000 working families for an entire year. The theatre situation reveals another layer of this entertainment inequality that's almost too cruel to discuss. Wealthy Victorians had private boxes at the opera where they could see and be seen, often attending more for social status than artistic appreciation. They owned season tickets that cost hundreds of pounds, attended performances in jewels and finery, and treated the theatre as their personal social club. Poor people stood in penny galleries, cramped, dangerous sections with no seating, if they could afford even that tiny admission fee. Many had never seen a professional performance of any kind. But here's what's truly mind-bending about Victorian entertainment. The wealthy were so bored by their unlimited options that they often created elaborate rules and restrictions just to make their pleasures more challenging. They developed complex etiquette for everything from card games to garden parties, not because these rules served any purpose, but because having too many choices made life feel meaningless. Poor people would have been grateful for any choice at all. Here's a story that perfectly illustrates this entertainment madness. In 1845, the Duchess of Marlborough complained in her diary about having nothing to do. Despite having access to private libraries, art collections, musical instruments, extensive gardens, and unlimited funds for any conceivable entertainment. She hired a boredom consultant. Yes, that was a real job, to help her find meaningful ways to spend her time. That same week, factory worker Ellen Morrison spent her only free hour teaching her children to sing, using songs her own mother had taught her, creating joy from absolutely nothing. The gambling culture shows perhaps the most obscene aspect of wealthy Victorian entertainment. Aristocrats regularly wagered amounts at their card tables that exceeded working families' lifetime earnings. They bet on everything: horse races, dice games, even which raindrop would reach the bottom of a window first. These weren't just games. They were displays of wealth so extreme that losing a fortune was considered entertaining. Poor people couldn't afford to gamble because they had nothing to lose except their survival. And let's talk about country house parties for a moment. Entertainment events that lasted for weeks and cost more than building entire villages. Wealthy families would invite dozens of guests to their estates for elaborate celebrations featuring multiple meals per day, professional entertainment, hunting expeditions, and social activities that required armies of servants to coordinate. The Duke of Westminster's autumn party in 1847 cost $8,000 and lasted 3 weeks. Poor families were grateful if they could afford to celebrate a child's birthday with an extra crust of bread. Here's a detail that shows how completely different these entertainment worlds were. Wealthy Victorians often complained about the burden of managing their leisure time. They employed social secretaries to coordinate their amusements, entertainment coordinators to plan their pleasures, and schedule managers to ensure they weren't overwhelmed by too much fun. Poor people managed their entertainment with desperate efficiency, grabbing moments of joy whenever possible because they never knew when the next opportunity might come. The music situation reveals another dimension of this inequality that's almost too painful to discuss. Wealthy homes featured multiple pianos, harps, and other instruments worth thousands of pounds. They employed private music teachers, hosted concerts in their own ballrooms, and collected musical instruments like art pieces. Many owned instruments they never played, kept simply for display. Poor families made music with homemade instruments, tin whistles, wooden flutes carved from scraps, percussion from whatever they could find. Yet often their music, born from genuine emotion and shared experience, carried more soul than all the expensive entertainment money could buy. The reading and literature entertainment shows another stark divide. Wealthy libraries contained thousands of books, including first editions, rare manuscripts, and works in multiple languages. Reading was considered a primary form of entertainment, with families gathering for elaborate literary discussions and book clubs. Poor people shared single books among entire neighbourhoods, treating each volume like a precious treasure because it might be the only literature they'd ever own. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Victorian entertainment inequality was how it affected children's development and dreams. Wealthy children grew up expecting constant amusement, developing sophisticated tastes and broad cultural knowledge that would serve them throughout their privileged lives. Poor children learned to create entertainment from nothing, developing imagination and resourcefulness that helped them survive, but never experiencing the joy that should be every child's birthright. As we've discovered, Victorian entertainment wasn't just about having fun. It was about determining who deserved happiness, who could access culture and beauty, and who would spend their brief lives in unrelenting grimness, broken only by moments of stolen joy. But if you think the entertainment disparities reveal the cruelest aspect of Victorian inequality, prepare yourself for something even more shocking. When we examine the world hidden below stairs, the secret lives of servants who made wealthy leisure possible, we'll uncover a parallel universe of human relationships, hidden dramas, and survival strategies that the wealthy never suspected existed right under their own roofs. Behind the gilded doors of Apsley House, while the Duke of Wellington entertains guests with tales of military glory, a secret world thrives in the shadows below. 53 servants move through hidden corridors like ghosts, their lives governed by rules so strict they make military discipline seem casual. Yet what unfolds in the servants' quarters would shock their wealthy employers. Passionate love affairs conducted in stolen moments between duties, elaborate social hierarchies that mirror the world above, and survival strategies that would impress the most cunning politicians. Tonight, as the Duke sleeps peacefully in silk sheets, his head housemaid Mary Crawford sits by candlelight writing in her secret diary, documenting a parallel universe of human drama that exists just feet away from unimaginable luxury, yet remains completely invisible to those who benefit from it. Here's what will absolutely stagger you about the hidden world of Victorian servants. They created entire societies within the great houses, complete with their own rules, relationships, and power structures that were often more complex than the families they served. A large estate like Chatsworth employed over 200 servants, creating an underground community larger than many villages, yet the wealthy family upstairs might know fewer than 10 of them by name. Let me paint you a picture of servant hierarchy that's so elaborate it rivals royal courts. At the top sat the butler and housekeeper, positions of such authority they earned more than many middle-class professionals and wielded power over dozens of lives. Below them cascaded layers of specialization: ladies' maids, valets, footmen, parlour maids, kitchen maids, scullery maids, and at the bottom, the tweenies, girls as young as 12 who worked between floors, invisible even to other servants. Each level had distinct uniforms, privileges, and responsibilities, creating a caste system that determined everything from where you could sit during meals to whom you were allowed to speak. Now let's step into the daily reality of servant life and prepare to have your assumptions shattered. While their employers enjoyed leisurely breakfasts at 10 a.m., servants had been working for 6 hours already. Mary Crawford's diary, discovered in 1987 during house renovations, reveals that her typical day began at 4:30 a.m. with lighting fires throughout the mansion and didn't end until midnight after serving the family's evening entertainment. That's 19 and a half hours of labour, 7 days a week, for wages that amounted to $20 per year, less than wealthy families spent on flowers. But here's where this gets truly fascinating. Servant communities developed their own rich cultures, complete with romances that would make modern soap operas seem tame. Upper servants, like butlers and housekeepers, lived in relative comfort, often occupying rooms nicer than most working-class homes, and their relationships were treated with the same seriousness as aristocratic marriages. The engagement between Chatsworth's head gardener and the Duke's personal secretary in 1847 was celebrated with more enthusiasm by the servant community than many aristocratic weddings receive from their social circles. Here's a detail that will blow your mind about servant economics. The most senior servants often accumulated enough savings to live like minor gentry in their retirement. Charles Carson, butler to the Earl of Pembroke for 30 years, retired with $3,000 in savings and purchased a cottage that would have been envied by many middle-class families. This success came at enormous personal cost. Most servants never married because their positions required complete devotion to their employers' families, leaving no time or energy for families of their own. Have you ever wondered what happened in those servants' halls after the wealthy family went to bed? The answer reveals a parallel social world that was often more vibrant than the formal entertaining happening upstairs. Servants organised elaborate parties, staged theatrical performances, and created their own entertainment that could last until dawn, as long as they were ready to work again at sunrise. The contraband wine and leftover delicacies from upstairs parties fueled celebrations that the employers never knew existed. Let me tell you about something called the servant grapevine that was more efficient than any modern communication system. Information travelled through the servant networks of great houses with lightning speed. When Lady Pemberton's affair with her riding instructor began in 1846, every servant in England's aristocratic houses knew about it within a week, yet her husband remained oblivious for months. The servants' information network was so sophisticated they often knew about family scandals, financial troubles, and social disasters before the families themselves fully understood their situations. Here's something that perfectly captures the twisted relationship between masters and servants. Wealthy families often treated their favourite servants like beloved pets, showering them with affection and gifts while maintaining absolute control over their lives. The Duchess of Marlborough kept detailed diaries about her lady's maid's health, happiness, and personal relationships, yet paid her so little that the maid couldn't afford decent winter clothing. This wasn't cruelty. It was the casual blindness of people who genuinely believed their care excused their exploitation. The romantic relationships among servants reveal perhaps the most human aspect of this hidden world. Love affairs between different levels of the servant hierarchy could cause scandals that rocked entire households. When Chatsworth's head footman fell in love with a kitchen maid in 1848, it created a crisis that required intervention from the Duke himself, not because he cared about their happiness, but because their relationship was disrupting the household's efficiency. But here's what's truly heartbreaking about servant life. Many gave up everything for employers who viewed them as living furniture. Personal servants like valets and ladies' maids devoted their entire lives to single families, becoming experts in their employers' preferences, needs, and moods. They sacrificed their own chances for marriage, children, and independent lives to ensure their master's comfort. Yet they could be dismissed instantly for the smallest infraction, leaving them homeless and unemployable after decades of loyal service. Here's a story that illustrates the complexity of these relationships perfectly. When the Earl of Derby's longtime butler, Thomas Harrison, fell ill in 1847, the Earl paid for the finest medical care and even hired additional help so Harrison could recover properly. Yet when Harrison's recovery took longer than expected, the Earl complained bitterly in his journal about the inconvenience of his servant's illness. This wasn't unusual. Wealthy employers often displayed genuine affection for servants, while remaining completely indifferent to their humanity. The living conditions below stairs tell their own story of inequality within inequality. Senior servants enjoyed private rooms, quality furniture, and decent food. Junior servants slept in cramped attics, shared beds with strangers, and ate scraps from the family table. A head butler might live more comfortably than many middle-class professionals, while scullery maids endured conditions that would be considered inhumane by any modern standard. And let's talk about the secret communication systems that servants developed to survive in these grand houses. They created elaborate codes for discussing their employers, hand signals for coordinating work, and even secret passages for moving through houses without being seen by family members. Some great houses had entire networks of hidden staircases and corridors designed specifically to keep servants invisible while they performed the magic that made wealthy life possible. Here's a detail that shows how sophisticated servant communities became. They developed their own educational systems. Senior servants would teach junior ones not just work skills, but reading, writing, and social graces that could help them advance in their careers. The butler's pantry at many great houses functioned as an informal school where ambitious young servants could learn the skills needed to rise through the ranks. The gift economy among servants reveals another fascinating aspect of this hidden world. They shared resources, supported each other through crises, and created informal insurance systems that protected them when official support failed. When a servant lost their position, the community would pool money, provide references, and help them find new employment. This mutual aid network was often more reliable than anything the wealthy employers provided, but perhaps the most shocking aspect of servant life was how they navigated the moral complexities of their positions. They were expected to maintain their employers' secrets while preserving their own integrity, to show loyalty while protecting themselves from exploitation, to appear grateful while earning every penny of their meagre wages. Many servants developed sophisticated philosophical frameworks for understanding their place in the world that would impress university scholars. The seasonal rhythms of servant life followed the wealthy family's social calendar, but with exhausting intensity that the employers never witnessed. When the family travelled to London for the social season, servants worked around the clock preparing, packing, travelling, unpacking, and then maintaining multiple households simultaneously. The logistics alone required military-level coordination that went completely unrecognised by the families who benefited from it. As we've discovered, the world below stairs wasn't just about service. It was about creating entire civilizations within civilizations, complete with their own values, relationships, and survival strategies that often displayed more wisdom and humanity than the world above. But if you think the servant community represented the most complex aspect of Victorian social dynamics, wait until you see what happened when these carefully maintained social boundaries were crossed. The Victorian justice system revealed inequalities so extreme that the same action could result in a slap on the wrist for the wealthy or a death sentence for the poor, showing that even the law itself became a tool for maintaining the very inequality that was tearing society apart. Two men stand in the dock at London's Old Bailey courthouse on the same March morning in 1847, both accused of stealing bread worth exactly 1 shilling. Lord Henry Cavendish's son, caught red-handed taking a loaf from a baker's cart during a drunken wager with his university friends, faces the magistrate with amusement rather than fear. His father's barrister argues that this was merely a youthful prank by a spirited young gentleman, and within an hour Henry walks free with a stern warning and a fine that his family pays without blinking. In the very next case, Thomas Mitchell, a desperate father of 4 whose children haven't eaten in 3 days, receives a death sentence for the identical crime. The judge declares that Thomas's theft demonstrates the dangerous criminal tendencies of the lower classes and sentences him to hang as an example to others who might dare to feed their starving families. Here's what will absolutely shock you about Victorian justice. The law wasn't just applied differently to rich and poor, it was literally written to protect wealth while criminalizing poverty. The same legal code that allowed wealthy men to beat their servants with impunity made it a capital offence for poor people to steal food worth more than 5 shillings. This wasn't accidental inequality, it was systematic oppression disguised as jurisprudence. Let me take you inside a Victorian courtroom, because what passed for justice will stagger you. When wealthy defendants appeared before magistrates, they arrived with teams of expensive barristers, character witnesses from high society, and legal arguments that could delay proceedings for months. Their trials resembled elaborate theatrical performances where guilt or innocence mattered less than social connections and financial resources. Poor defendants got 5 minutes with overworked public advocates who'd never met them before the trial began, if they got representation at all. Now let's examine the crimes themselves, and prepare to have your sense of justice completely overturned. Wealthy Victorians committed what we'd now call white-collar crimes on a massive scale, embezzling from charities, defrauding investors, exploiting workers, yet these activities were rarely prosecuted because they were conducted through legitimate business practices. Meanwhile, poor people were executed for survival crimes, stealing bread, poaching rabbits, or taking coal to heat their freezing homes. But here's where this gets truly horrifying. The punishment system was designed to terrorize the poor while barely inconveniencing the wealthy. A working-class person caught stealing might face transportation to Australia, public flogging, or hanging. A wealthy person caught with stolen goods worth 10 times more might face a small fine or brief imprisonment in comfortable quarters, with servants allowed to attend them. The message was clear. Your social class determined not just your guilt or innocence, but whether you deserved to live or die. Here's a detail that will blow your mind about Victorian prison conditions. They literally had different classes of imprisonment based on your ability to pay. First-class prisoners, usually wealthy debtors or gentlemen convicted of minor offences, lived in private rooms with their own furniture, could wear their own clothes, order meals from outside and receive unlimited visitors. Third-class prisoners, almost exclusively poor, lived in tiny cells, wore degrading uniforms, ate gruel, and were allowed 1 visitor per month if they were lucky. Have you ever wondered what happened when wealthy people committed truly serious crimes? The answer reveals a justice system so corrupt it defies belief. When Lord Byron's cousin killed a man in a duel in 1844, he claimed temporary insanity and was acquitted after character witnesses testified about his gentle nature. When a poor man killed someone in self-defense the same year, he was hanged within a week because the court declared that violence is the natural state of the criminal classes. Let me tell you about something called benefit of clergy that perfectly illustrates this legal insanity. Originally a medieval law allowing priests to be tried in church courts, by Victorian times it had evolved into a loophole that allowed anyone who could read to escape death sentences for many crimes. Since literacy was a privilege of wealth, this essentially created a legal system where your ability to read determined whether you lived or died. Poor people who couldn't read were executed, while wealthy criminals who could recite a simple Bible verse walked free. Here's a story that captures the absolute madness of Victorian justice. In 1846, the Earl of Cardigan shot a man during a duel, then used his hereditary right to be tried by the House of Lords rather than a regular court. His fellow nobles declared the duel a matter of honour and acquitted him unanimously. That same week, a factory worker named James Morrison was hanged for stealing a horse worth $2, less than the Earl spent on ammunition for his illegal duel. The police system itself reflected this class-based approach to crime and punishment. In wealthy neighbourhoods, constables were polite, well-dressed, and focused on protecting property and maintaining order. In poor areas, police were essentially occupation forces, using brutal tactics to control populations seen as inherently criminal. The same officer might tip his hat respectfully to a wealthy man and beat a poor man senseless for the exact same behaviour. But here's what's truly mind-bending about Victorian legal inequality. Wealthy people could literally purchase justice through the fee system. Everything from filing charges to appealing verdicts required payments that only the rich could afford. Poor people often couldn't even get their cases heard because they lacked the money for basic court fees. Justice wasn't blind. It was explicitly for sale to the highest bidder. Here's a detail that shows how completely different these legal worlds were. Wealthy families employed legal advisors whose full-time job was keeping them out of trouble. These weren't lawyers for after crimes were committed. They were preventive specialists who ensured wealthy behaviour never technically became criminal. Poor people had no such protection, and often didn't even know they were breaking laws until they were arrested. The death penalty statistics reveal perhaps the most shocking aspect of Victorian justice inequality. Between 1840 and 1850, over 90% of people executed were working class, despite wealthy people committing crimes with far greater financial impact. The gallows became a tool of class warfare, used to eliminate undesirable poor people, while protecting wealthy criminals who posed actual threats to society. And let's talk about debt laws for a moment, because they reveal the twisted logic of Victorian justice. Poor people could be imprisoned indefinitely for owing tiny amounts, sometimes as little as a few shillings. They'd be locked in debtors' prisons where they couldn't work to pay off their debts, creating cycles of imprisonment that could last lifetimes. Wealthy people who owed thousands could simply declare bankruptcy, pay reduced settlements, and continue living in luxury while their creditors absorbed the losses. Here's something that perfectly illustrates the insanity of this system. Wealthy people could commit the exact same crime multiple times with increasing penalties, while poor people were executed for first offences. Lord Melbourne's nephew was caught stealing horses 3 times, and received progressively larger fines before finally receiving a brief prison sentence in comfortable quarters. Poor horse thieves were hanged on their first offence because swift justice prevents future crime. The witness system shows another dimension of legal inequality that's almost too cynical to believe. Wealthy defendants could produce dozens of character witnesses, family friends, business associates, social connections, who would testify to their good character regardless of the evidence. Poor defendants had no such network and were often portrayed as inherently untrustworthy because of their social status alone. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Victorian justice was how it destroyed families and communities. When poor breadwinners were imprisoned or executed for survival crimes, their families faced destitution and often death. Children became orphans, spouses became destitute, and entire families were destroyed for crimes that wealthy people committed casually without consequence. The justice system became a weapon against the poor that perpetuated the very inequality it claimed to protect society from. The appeals process reveals the final cruel irony of Victorian justice. Wealthy defendants could appeal verdicts through multiple courts, hire new lawyers, and delay punishments for years while they exhausted every legal option. Poor defendants were often executed within days of their trials because they lacked the money for appeals or the connections to delay justice. Time itself became a luxury that only money could buy. As we've seen, Victorian justice wasn't about maintaining order or protecting society. It was about using law as a tool to maintain class divisions and protect wealth, while criminalizing poverty itself. But if you think the legal inequalities were the cruelest manifestation of Victorian class warfare, prepare yourself for something that will haunt you. When we examine how these two worlds face death itself, the one experience that should unite all humanity, we'll discover that even in their final moments, the wealthy and poor inhabited completely different realities of dignity, comfort, and human worth. Death arrives for two souls on the same winter evening in 1848, but their final journeys could not be more different. The Duke of Marlborough breathes his last in a bedroom larger than most churches, surrounded by grieving family, attended by 3 physicians, and drifting away peacefully on silk pillows, while priests offer final blessings, and servants stand ready to fulfill his every comfort. His death is a gentle transition from one luxury to another. Meanwhile, in a Manchester workhouse infirmary, 9-year-old Timothy Walsh dies alone on a straw mattress crawling with lice, his body finally succumbing to tuberculosis that could have been cured if he'd been born into wealth. No family surrounds him. They're all working 16-hour shifts just to survive. No doctor attends him. Workhouse physicians see 50 patients per day and can spare no time for dying children. Timothy's death is brutal, lonely, and utterly preventable. Here's what will absolutely stagger you about Victorian death. The wealthy didn't just die more comfortably. They lived in a world where death itself was transformed into an elaborate performance of status, complete with professional mourners, imported flowers, and ceremonies that cost more than most people would see in their lifetimes. The Duke's funeral will employ 200 people and cost $10,000, while Timothy's body will be thrown into a mass grave with dozens of other paupers, unmarked and unmourned. Let me take you inside the death chamber of a wealthy Victorian, because the excess surrounding even dying is almost too elaborate to believe. When Lord Byron's daughter fell ill in 1847, her deathbed scene resembled a royal court. Teams of specialists monitored her condition, priests provided spiritual comfort, family members kept vigil in shifts, and servants ensured that even her final moments occurred in perfect comfort. Her bedroom was maintained at precisely the right temperature, filled with fresh flowers changed daily, and equipped with the finest medical equipment money could buy. Now contrast that with the reality of poor people's deaths, and prepare to have your heart shattered. Working families watch their loved ones die in crowded, unsanitary conditions, where disease spread rapidly between the living and the dying. They had no pain relief, no medical intervention, and often no time to properly mourn because missing work meant the survivors wouldn't eat. Children died in their parents' arms while those parents calculated whether they could afford to miss a day's wages for the funeral. But here's where this gets truly heartbreaking. Wealthy Victorians had the luxury of what they called good deaths. Long illnesses that allowed for proper farewells, spiritual preparation, and dignified departures surrounded by loved ones. Poor people usually died suddenly from accidents, disease or exhaustion, with no opportunity for closure or proper goodbyes. Death for the wealthy was a planned event. Death for the poor was a violent interruption. Here's a detail that will blow your mind about wealthy Victorian funeral preparations. They began planning their deaths years in advance, treating their funerals like elaborate theatrical productions. The Earl of Derby's funeral plans, discovered in his estate papers, included detailed instructions for the type of wood for his coffin, imported mahogany, the specific flowers for his arrangements, orchids from 3 countries, the music for his service, a 40-piece orchestra, and even the refreshments for mourners, a feast costing more than most annual salaries. Have you ever wondered what happened to poor people's bodies after death? The answer reveals perhaps the most cruel aspect of Victorian inequality. Wealthy corpses were embalmed by specialists dressed in fine clothing and displayed in elaborate coffins lined with silk. Poor bodies were often buried within hours of death in shared graves, wrapped in whatever fabric families could afford, if they could afford anything at all. Many were simply thrown into pauper pits, mass graves containing dozens of bodies with no individual markers or dignity. Let me tell you about Victorian mourning customs that perfectly illustrate this death inequality. Wealthy families observed elaborate mourning periods lasting up to 3 years, during which they wore specific clothing, followed detailed social protocols, and gradually transitioned through different phases of grief. They could afford to stop working, stop socializing, and dedicate themselves entirely to honoring their dead. Poor families had no such luxury. They mourned while working, grieved while struggling to survive, and often couldn't afford mourning clothes at all. Here's something that will stagger you about Victorian funeral costs. A single wealthy funeral often cost more than an entire working-class family would earn in a decade. The funeral of the Duchess of Sutherland in 1849 featured a procession of 50 carriages, 200 professional mourners dressed in custom-made black clothing, a church service with imported flowers costing $2,000, and a burial feast for 500 guests. The total expense exceeded $15,000, enough money to have prevented hundreds of deaths in the slums through improved sanitation and medical care. The cemetery situation reveals another layer of death inequality that's almost too cruel to discuss. Wealthy Victorians were buried in elaborate private mausoleums or exclusive sections of prestigious cemeteries, their graves marked with expensive monuments that celebrated their lives and achievements. Poor people were buried in overcrowded public graveyards where bodies were stacked in layers, often with no individual graves at all. Many poor cemeteries were so overused that new burials required digging up old remains to make room. But here's what's truly mind-bending about Victorian death culture. The wealthy created an entire industry around elaborate mourning that employed thousands of people while ignoring the preventable deaths happening all around them. They spent fortunes on mourning jewellery, special funeral flowers, and professional grief services, yet showed no interest in addressing the conditions that killed poor people by the thousands every year. Here's a story that captures this perfectly. When the Earl of Pemberton's infant son died in 1846, the family spent $3,000 on a funeral that featured a tiny white coffin lined with silk, carried by 6 white horses, followed by a procession of mourning carriages through London. The same week, government records show that 47 children died in the workhouses of his own estates from malnutrition and disease, deaths that could have been prevented with a fraction of what he spent on his son's funeral. The contrast in grief support shows another dimension of this inequality. Wealthy families had entire support networks, family physicians to manage their emotional health, clergy to provide spiritual comfort, and social circles that understood the importance of proper mourning. Poor families grieved alone, often while dealing with the additional hardships that a family member's death created: lost income, increased expenses, and the practical challenges of survival without their loved one's contribution. And let's talk about children's deaths for a moment, because the disparity here is almost too painful to bear. When wealthy children died, they became the subjects of elaborate memorial portraits, beautiful headstones, and family shrines that preserved their memory for generations. Poor children often died without anyone even recording their names. They became statistics in government reports, numbers in mortality tables, forgotten souls whose brief lives left no trace except in their families' broken hearts. Here's a detail that shows how completely different these death worlds were. Wealthy Victorians employed death photographers who created elaborate post-mortem portraits of deceased family members, treating death as an opportunity for artistic expression. These photographs, often the only images families had of their loved ones, were carefully staged with flowers, religious symbols, and expensive clothing. Poor families couldn't afford photographs of their living children, let alone memorial portraits of their dead. The will and inheritance process reveals the final cruel irony of Victorian death inequality. Wealthy people's deaths transferred vast fortunes to their heirs, ensuring that inequality continued into the next generation. Poor people's deaths often left their families deeper in poverty. Funeral expenses they couldn't afford, lost income they couldn't replace, and debts they couldn't pay. Death made the rich richer and the poor poorer. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Victorian death inequality was the spiritual dimension. Wealthy people died believing they were going to heaven because their prosperity proved God's favour. Poor people often died believing they deserved their suffering because society taught them that poverty was evidence of moral failure. Even in death, inequality poisoned people's understanding of their own worth and dignity. The medical care during final illness shows another stark contrast that defined these different deaths. Wealthy patients received experimental treatments, pain medications, and comfort care that eased their suffering. Poor patients received no medical intervention at all, often dying in agony from conditions that were easily treatable if you had money for treatment. The quality of dying became yet another privilege that money could buy. As we've discovered, Victorian death wasn't just about ending life. It was about determining whose life had meaning, whose passing deserved attention, and whose memory would be preserved for future generations. But if you think the death inequalities represented the ultimate expression of Victorian class divisions, you're about to discover something remarkable. From the depths of this seemingly hopeless system emerged rebels and reformers who dared to challenge the established order. The stories of those who fought against inequality and the terrible price they paid for their courage will reveal the seeds of change that would eventually transform society forever. Through the smoky haze of a Manchester factory in 1842, a voice rises above the deafening machinery, not in complaint, but in revolution. Elizabeth Gaskell, wife of a Unitarian minister and daughter of privilege, stands among mill workers documenting conditions so horrific that her own social class will call her a traitor for exposing them. But here's what will absolutely blow your mind. While she risks her reputation and safety to fight for workers' rights, the mill owner she's challenging, Lord Ashley, will become one of the most powerful reformers in Parliament, using his inherited wealth and aristocratic connections to pass laws that transform British society. Tonight we witness the extraordinary paradox of Victorian reform. Sometimes the greatest champions of the poor came from the very class that oppressed them, while the most dangerous enemies of change were those who had the most to gain from equality. Here's what will stagger you about Victorian reform movements. They weren't led by the people you'd expect. Some of the most radical voices for change came from within the wealthy establishment itself, aristocrats who witnessed the system's brutality and chose to betray their own class rather than remain silent. Yet these unlikely revolutionaries faced a terrible choice: maintain their privilege and ignore suffering, or sacrifice everything to fight for people who might never even know their names. Let me paint you a picture of what it meant to challenge the Victorian system, because the courage required was almost superhuman. When Charles Dickens began writing about workhouse conditions in 1838, he received death threats from wealthy factory owners, was ostracised by former friends, and faced financial ruin as publishers refused his work. Yet he continued documenting the horrors he witnessed, using his novels as weapons against inequality. His descriptions were so accurate that the government launched investigations based entirely on his fictional accounts. Now let's step into the world of working-class resistance and prepare to have your assumptions about powerlessness completely overturned. The poor didn't just suffer in silence. They organised with the sophistication that would impress modern political strategists. The Chartist movement of the 1840s collected over 6 million signatures demanding political reform, creating the largest petition in human history up to that point. Yet most of the signers couldn't even read the document they were supporting, trusting in a future they might never live to see. But here's where this gets truly heartbreaking. The price of rebellion for working people was often death. The Peterloo Massacre of 1819 saw cavalry charge into a peaceful gathering of 60,000 workers demanding political representation, killing 15 and injuring over 700. Yet the survivors regrouped within months, their determination only strengthened by government brutality. They understood that dying for change was better than living without hope. Here's a detail that will blow your mind about wealthy reformers. Many sacrificed everything, including their own families' futures, to fight for people they'd never met. Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, spent his personal fortune investigating child labour conditions, publishing reports that destroyed his social standing and cost him lucrative business relationships. His own children suffered reduced inheritances because he chose humanity over wealth, yet he never stopped fighting, even when his own family questioned his priorities. Have you ever wondered what drove some wealthy people to betray their own class interests? The answer reveals the power of human conscience when confronted with undeniable truth. Lady Byron, after witnessing children working in mills she partially owned, sold her shares at massive losses and used the money to establish schools for working-class children. She wrote in her diary, "I cannot profit from the destruction of childhood itself." Her decision cost her family $50,000, but saved countless young lives. Let me tell you about the underground networks that connected reformers across class lines, because they operated with the secrecy of spy organizations. Wealthy sympathizers would fund working-class organizers, provide meeting spaces in their homes, and use their social connections to protect activists from government persecution. Factory owner Robert Owen risked bankruptcy by implementing 8-hour workdays and decent wages in his mills, proving that ethical business was possible even when it wasn't profitable. Here's something that perfectly captures the courage of Victorian rebels. They faced not just government opposition, but social exile from their own communities. When Anglican minister Charles Kingsley began preaching about workers' rights from his pulpit in 1848, he was banned from speaking at other churches, lost wealthy patrons, and received threats against his family. Yet he continued, declaring that Christianity meant nothing if it didn't defend the defenseless. The women reformers faced perhaps the greatest challenges of all, battling both class inequality and gender oppression simultaneously. Frances Wright, daughter of a wealthy Scottish family, shocked society by speaking publicly about workers' rights at a time when women weren't supposed to have political opinions. She was pelted with rotten vegetables, called a dangerous radical, and socially ostracized. Yet she persisted, becoming one of the first women to address mixed-gender audiences about political issues. But here's what's truly mind-bending about Victorian reform. Some of the most effective changes came from unexpected alliances between upper-class women and working-class men. The 10 Hours movement, which limited children's working hours, succeeded because aristocratic ladies like Lady Byron provided funding and social legitimacy, while working men provided grassroots organisation and political pressure. These unlikely partnerships broke down barriers that had seemed permanent. Here's a story that illustrates the complexity of reform perfectly. When the young Benjamin Disraeli, future Prime Minister, published his novel Sybil in 1845, exposing the brutal conditions of industrial England, he was attacked by both conservatives who called him a traitor and radicals who didn't trust a wealthy politician's motivations. Yet the book became a catalyst for reform precisely because it came from inside the establishment, lending credibility to claims that working-class activists had been making for years. The religious reformers created perhaps the most powerful moral arguments against inequality. Evangelical Christians like William Wilberforce had already proven that moral crusades could change laws through their successful campaign against slavery. They applied the same techniques to industrial reform, arguing that Christian society couldn't tolerate the systematic destruction of human dignity. Their sermons became political manifestos, their churches became organizing centers, and their moral authority became unstoppable political force. And let's talk about the role of journalism in Victorian reform, because investigative reporting became a weapon of social change. Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor, published in the 1850s, included interviews and statistics that made inequality undeniable. His work was so detailed and shocking that Parliament was forced to respond with legislation. Yet Mayhew faced constant threats and legal challenges from those whose crimes he exposed. Here's a detail that shows how dangerous reform work could be. Activists developed elaborate code words and secret communication systems to avoid government persecution. The word reform itself became dangerous, so they spoke of improvement or progress. They held meetings in churches, private homes, and even cemeteries to avoid police surveillance. The fight for justice required the methods of underground resistance. The international dimension of Victorian reform reveals how ideas crossed borders faster than governments could suppress them. European revolutionaries fleeing political persecution brought new organising techniques to British reform movements. American abolitionists shared strategies with British labour organisers. The fight against inequality became a global movement that governments couldn't contain within national borders. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Victorian reform was how it changed the reformers themselves. Wealthy activists who began by trying to help the poor often ended up understanding that the entire system needed transformation. They started as charitable donors and became revolutionary thinkers, their privileged perspectives forever altered by contact with genuine human suffering. The generational conflict within wealthy families tells its own story of social change. Young aristocrats returning from universities with new ideas about social justice faced parents who saw reform as a betrayal of family traditions. Inheritance disputes erupted over funding for reform causes. Some wealthy children were disowned for their political beliefs, choosing justice over family loyalty in decisions that required extraordinary moral courage. The government's response to reform movements reveals how threatened the establishment felt by calls for change. Peaceful protesters were labelled as dangerous revolutionaries. Reformist publications were banned or censored. Public meetings were infiltrated by government spies. The machinery of state power was deployed against people demanding basic human dignity, proving that the system understood exactly how radical true equality would be. As we've seen, Victorian reform wasn't just about improving conditions. It was about courageous individuals choosing to sacrifice their own comfort and security to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. These unlikely alliances between classes created the foundation for changes that would eventually transform society. And now, as we reach the end of our journey through Victorian inequality, we must ask the most important question of all. What does this brutal chapter of history teach us about our own world? The parallels between Victorian inequality and modern challenges will shock you, and the lessons hidden within these historical extremes will reveal truths about human nature, social justice, and the possibility of change that will challenge everything you think you know about progress itself. Today, as I write this script in 2025, a tech billionaire's weekend yacht party costs more than the annual GDP of several small nations, while 3.2 billion people survive on less than $5.50 per day. Sound familiar? The Victorian era didn't end. It evolved, trading top hats for tech platforms, carriages for private jets, and factory towns for global supply chains. But here's what will shock you most. Despite 175 years of supposed progress, the mathematical relationship between the richest and poorest remains eerily similar to Victorian England. The tools have changed, but the fundamental structure of extreme inequality persists with a sophistication that would make Victorian aristocrats envious. What we've discovered tonight isn't just history. It's a mirror reflecting our own world with uncomfortable clarity. The Victorian poor walked miles for basic necessities. Today's poor work multiple jobs yet can't afford rent in the cities where they labour. Victorian children worked in factories. Modern children work in sweatshops making products for companies worth more than entire countries. The locations have shifted, but the human cost of extreme inequality remains devastatingly familiar. Here's what's truly mind-bending about this historical parallel. We have technology and wealth that Victorian reformers could never have imagined. Yet we've created new forms of the same old inequalities. Victorian workers couldn't afford education. Today's students mortgage their futures for degrees that may not guarantee employment. Victorian poor died from preventable diseases. Today, Americans ration insulin they can't afford while pharmaceutical companies report record profits. Let me share some numbers that will make you reconsider everything about progress. In 1848, the richest 1% of Britain controlled about 70% of the nation's wealth. Today, the richest 1% globally control roughly 47% of total wealth. An improvement, but not as dramatic as we might hope after nearly 2 centuries of supposed advancement. The mechanism of concentration has become more sophisticated, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. But here's where this gets personal for all of us. The Victorian era teaches us that extreme inequality isn't just bad for the poor, it's ultimately destructive for everyone, including the wealthy. Victorian society's obsession with maintaining class divisions consumed enormous resources that could have been used for innovation, exploration, and human development. How much human potential are we wasting today by accepting systems that leave billions of people struggling to survive? The most powerful lesson from Victorian England isn't about how bad things were, it's about how dramatically they could change when enough people decided change was necessary. The brutal inequality we've explored tonight didn't last forever. Child labour laws, workers' rights, public education, healthcare systems, these weren't inevitable developments. They were fought for by people who refused to accept that human suffering was natural or necessary. Here's something that should give us hope. The very reforms that seemed impossible to Victorian minds are now considered basic human rights. The 8-hour workday, the weekend, public schools, workplace safety standards, these were once radical ideas that threatened the established order. What seems impossible about our current challenges might be tomorrow's common sense, if we have the courage to fight for it. Think about this. Victorian reformers achieved massive changes without the internet, global communication, or democratic institutions that we take for granted today. They organized using handwritten letters, secret meetings, and pure determination. We have tools for organizing and creating change that they couldn't have imagined, yet often we feel more powerless than they did. Perhaps the real lesson is that change comes not from technology, but from the human decision to no longer accept the unacceptable. The Victorian story also reveals something profound about human nature, that extreme inequality corrupts everyone it touches, including those it supposedly benefits. The wealthy Victorians we've met tonight weren't necessarily evil people. They were trapped in a system that made their privileges dependent on others' suffering. This created psychological and moral damage that money couldn't heal. Today's ultra-wealthy face similar challenges. How do you find meaning and connection when your lifestyle depends on global systems that cause immense human suffering? But perhaps the most important insight from our Victorian journey is this. Inequality isn't a natural law like gravity. It's a human creation, which means humans can change it. Every extreme disparity we've explored tonight was maintained by specific laws, customs, and institutions that seemed permanent until they weren't. The children working in mills, the families living in single rooms, the servants sacrificing their lives for others' comfort. None of this was inevitable. It was chosen, maintained, and eventually changed by human decisions. So where does this leave us as we face our own era's challenges? The Victorian experience suggests that change is possible, but it requires the same qualities that transformed 19th century England. Moral courage from unexpected places, alliances across social divisions, and the determination to keep fighting even when progress seems impossible. The next time you hear that extreme inequality is just how the world works, remember the Victorian poor who were told the same thing, yet whose children and grandchildren lived to see a completely transformed society. The next time someone argues that caring for the vulnerable is too expensive, remember that Victorian England spent more on single parties than it would have cost to eliminate child hunger entirely. Most importantly, remember that the comfortable often told the suffering to be patient, that change was coming slowly, that radical action was dangerous. Yet history shows us that the greatest improvements in human welfare came not from gradual evolution, but from moments when enough people decided that immediate action was a moral necessity. The Victorian era ended not because time passed, but because people chose to end it. They decided that human dignity was more important than traditional privileges, that children's lives mattered more than cheap labour, that the potential of all people was worth more than the comfort of the few. As we've seen tonight, the Victorians built a world of shocking inequality that seemed permanent and natural to those who lived within it. Yet within a few generations, most of their cruel certainties had crumbled. The future they couldn't imagine, where working-class children could become doctors, where women could vote, where basic dignity was considered a human right, became reality because people refused to accept that the world couldn't change. Tonight's journey through Victorian inequality hasn't just been about the past. It's been about recognizing the patterns that persist today and understanding that we have the power to change them. The question isn't whether we can create a more just world. The question is whether we'll have the courage to do